You picked the wrong place. Jack said, his voice so quiet it barely cleared the wreckage around him. Shattered coffee mugs, overturned tables, a cash register, lying face down on the floor like a knocked-out fighter. Dylan Cross stared at the old man standing in the middle of his destroyed diner, three of Dylan's crew already on the ground, groaning, unable to explain what happened. Dylan had walked in with 12 men. He still had 9. But for the first time in years, his hands were shaking. Before we go any further, if you're watching this right now, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it, because what happened next in Fairview, Montana changed everything. Jack Walker had been awake since 4:15 that morning, same as every morning for the last 18 years. He didn't need an alarm. His body had its own clock, the kind that gets installed in a person when they've spent enough years operating on someone else's schedule, when sleeping past 5 meant something had gone wrong. He woke up in the dark, lay still for exactly 30 seconds, the way he always did, listening to the silence of Fairview, Montana, and then he put his feet on the floor and started another day. The diner opened at 5:30. Jack was always there by 5. He liked the hour before the first customers arrived. He liked the smell of the grill warming up, the sound of the coffee maker running its first cycle, the way the early light came through the east-facing windows and turned everything in the dining room a color that didn't have a name but felt like the closest thing to peace he'd ever found. Walker's Diner sat at the end of Carlisle Street, a modest single-story building with a hand-painted sign that had been repainted twice since Jack bought the place. Once when a hailstorm took most of the letters, and once when his waitress Sarah had surprised him one Monday morning by showing up early with a fresh coat of paint and a steadier hand than the original sign painter had apparently possessed. Sarah Mitchell had worked for Jack for 3 years. She was 25, bright-eyed in a way that wasn't naive, just genuinely curious about people. And she had a memory for customer orders that put most waitstaff half her age to shame. She remembered that Roy Hendricks took his eggs over medium and his toast dark and his coffee without sugar, since his wife told him he was pre-diabetic. And she remembered that the Dunmore sisters from Maple Road always split a single order of pancakes on Saturday mornings because they'd been doing it since they were little girls eating with their father. And she remembered these things not because she'd written them down, but because she actually listened when people talked to her. Jack noticed that about her early on. It was the thing that made him hire her on the spot when she'd walked in asking about the handwritten "help wanted" sign in the window. Not her experience, which was limited. Not her references, which were decent but unremarkable. It was that she'd sat across from him during the interview and actually looked at him when he spoke, not at his hands or the table or some middle distance point that meant she was waiting for her turn to talk. At him. In Jack's experience, that kind of attention was rarer than most people understood. The morning of the day, everything changed, darted like every other morning. Jack made the coffee. He prepped the grill. He pulled the day's biscuits from the oven at 5:57, same as always, and set them on the rack to cool just enough so they didn't burn through the paper bags when the early customers ordered them to go. Roy Hendricks came in at 6:10 and took his usual stool at the counter. "Morning, Jack." "Morning, Roy. Eggs over medium toast, dark." Roy settled onto the stool with the particular care of a man whose knees have been complaining for a decade. "My daughter called last night, says she wants me to move to Billings." Jack poured the coffee without being asked. "What do you want?" Roy picked up the mug, wrapped both hands around it. "I want people to stop asking me what I want like I'm a problem that needs solving." Jack didn't say anything to that. He didn't need to. He turned back to the grill and cracked Roy's eggs against the edge with the practiced snap of someone who has done it tens of thousands of times. And Roy sat there with his coffee in the quiet, and both men understood each other perfectly. That was what Walker's Diner was. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't famous. It was a place where people could come and feel known without having to perform for anyone. A place where a man with bad knees and a daughter who worried too much could sit on a stool at 6 in the morning and not have to explain himself. Jack had built that, deliberately, carefully over 18 years. He had built it knowing full well that he was building something as far from his previous life as geography and intention and daily practice could carry a person. The people of Fairview knew Jack Walker as a kind man, a reliable man, the kind of neighbor who showed up with a bag of groceries when he heard someone was sick, who spent his own weekends helping fix the roof of the community center after the storm damage, who kept a jar on the counter for the volunteer fire department fundraiser and added to it himself when the donations ran slow. They knew him as the man who gave free meals on Thanksgiving to anyone who showed up alone, who had quietly paid more than one family's heating bill in January without telling anyone, and who would sit with you over a cup of coffee for as long as you needed if you were going through something hard. At 62, Jack Walker was to all appearances exactly what Fairview believed him to be. What Fairview did not know, what nobody in that town knew, because Jack had worked methodically and without apology to ensure they wouldn't, was that before the diner, before the peaceful mornings and the neighbors who waved from their cars, in the comfortable routine of a quiet life, Jack Walker had been someone else entirely. His real name wasn't Walker. That name he'd chosen himself the way some people choose a new name when they walk out of a courthouse or step off a bus in a new city and decide to become someone different. Jack had walked out of a life that would have killed him within another 3 years if he'd stayed in it, and he'd taken a new name the way you take a new coat in winter because the old one had too many holes in it and the cold was getting in. The name people used to call him in a different time and a different world was Ghost Rider. He didn't think about that name anymore. He had trained himself not to. 18 years of deliberate forgetting had worn most of the sharp edges down to something manageable, the way a river wears down stone, not gone, not destroyed, but smoothed into a shape that could be lived with. He thought about it the day Dylan Cross walked into his diner, but that didn't happen until evening. The day between was ordinary, or as close to ordinary as a day ever gets when something is already moving toward you like weather, like a system building over the mountains that the people in the valley can't see yet, but that is nonetheless coming. The lunch rush came and went. Sarah handled the floor with her usual easy competence while Jack worked the grill, and they moved around each other in the kitchen with the wordless efficiency of people who have spent enough time in close quarters to understand each other's rhythms. The afternoon was slow, the way Tuesday afternoons in Fairview always were, and Jack used the quiet to prep the dinner mise en place and catch up on the ordering ledger and drink 3 cups of coffee he probably didn't need. At 4:30, a man named Pete Holloway came in and sat at the counter and told Jack that a group of outsiders had been seen driving through town twice in the last 2 days. Young men in expensive cars, the kind of cars that didn't belong in Fairview, moving slow through the main street the way people do when they're looking for something or deciding something. Probably nothing, Pete said with the tone of a man who believed it was not probably nothing, but who hoped that saying so would make it true. Jack poured Pete a coffee he hadn't asked for and said, probably with the same tone, and both men sat with the word for a moment before Pete picked up his mug and changed the subject. After Pete left, Jack stood behind the counter for a long time, looking at nothing in particular. There was a quality to the quiet in the diner right then that felt different from the usual afternoon quiet. Charged somehow, the way air feels different before lightning. He'd felt that feeling before, a long time ago, in a different life. He pushed it down and went back to the kitchen and started on the dinner prep. Sarah arrived for her evening shift at 5, unwrapping a scarf from around her neck and hanging it on the hook by the back door and blowing out a breath that made a small cloud in the cooling air. Getting cold out there, she said. October. Right. She tied her apron strings and picked up her order pad. You okay? You look like something's on your mind. Jack glanced at her. I'm fine. You're doing the thing where you chop things very precisely. He looked down at the vegetables on the cutting board. They were, he had to admit, cut with a degree of exactness that went somewhat beyond what dinner prep required. I'm fine, he said again, and Sarah gave him the look she gave him when she knew he was lying, but wasn't going to push it, and they both went back to work. The dinner crowd was smaller than usual. By 7:30, there were only a handful of customers left, an elderly couple near the window. 2 men from the highway department at one of the center tables, and a teenager doing homework at the counter with a plate of fries going cold beside his notebook. Jack was in the kitchen when he heard the sound. He heard it before he understood what it was, a kind of collision of noise. Multiple voices at once, and then something breaking the specific percussive crash of something made of glass, hitting something made of floor. Then another crash, different pitch. Then a sound he recognized even through the walls of the kitchen and across 18 years of deliberate distance laughter that meant something was being destroyed, and the people doing the destroying were enjoying it. He came through the kitchen door and stopped. There were 12 of them, Young men, early 20s, wearing the kind of clothing that was meant to signal money and menace simultaneously. They had moved into the diner the way a tide moves, filling the space, pushing the existing atmosphere out in front of them. Two of the center tables had already been overturned. The sugar dispensers and napkin holders that had been on those tables were now on the floor. The two highway department men were on their feet, backing toward the wall with the particular body language of men who understood they were heavily outnumbered. The elderly couple by the window had gone very still. The teenager at the counter had his hands flat on the surface in front of him and was staring straight ahead. The one doing the most talking, one who was clearly the axis around which the others orbited, was leaning against the counter with one elbow like he owned the place, like he'd always owned it. He was maybe 23 with a face that might have been handsome if it hadn't been arranged into an expression of contempt so habitual it had started to leave marks. He was looking at Sarah. Sarah was behind the counter, very still, holding a coffee pot with both hands. "We're not looking for trouble," the young man was saying in the particular tone of someone who is looking for exactly that, but wants the pleasure of having the other person pretend otherwise first. "We just want some service. Is that so hard?" He reached out and picked up the coffee pot from Sarah's hands. Not grabbed it, picked it up, slowly, watching her face while he did it. Sarah's eyes moved to Jack when he came through the kitchen door. The young man followed her gaze and turned. "Well," he said, "there he is, the famous Jack Walker." He said it with a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "I've heard about you." Jack looked at him without expression. "I'm going to need you and your people to leave," Jack said. His voice was level, conversational, the way you'd ask someone to pass the salt. "That right?" The young man set the coffee pot down on the counter with exaggerated care. "See, I'm Dylan Cross, and my people don't leave places when old men ask them to." Dylan turned back to the room and swept his arm in a wide theatrical gesture. "Trash it," he said. And that was when everything changed. Three of the men moved toward the nearest table. One of them picked up a ketchup bottle and threw it against the wall. The sound was enormous in the enclosed space glass and ceramic, and a wet red explosion across the painted surface. Two more swept their arms across a table, sending plates and cups and silverware flying. The elderly couple by the window. The woman cried out one sharp sound like a small bird, and the man in front of her opened his arms to put himself between her and the chaos, which was something Jack registered in the part of his mind that was still taking in information, that old habit of tracking the room that he had tried to leave behind. The two highway department men were frozen against the wall. The teenager at the counter had his head down and his arms over his head. Dylan Cross watched all of it with the satisfied expression of someone watching a fireworks display they had arranged. Then one of Dylan's men, big, broad-shouldered, with a neck that suggested serious time spent in serious gyms, moved along the counter toward Sarah. He reached across the counter and grabbed her wrist. Sarah made a sound that wasn't quite a word, just involuntary, the sound that escapes when something frightens you, before your mind has had time to process what's happening. Jack moved. He wasn't aware of making a decision. Something in him that had been dormant for 18 years simply engaged the way a machine that has been in storage will run when you put power to it, hesitatingly for just a moment, then with the full force of everything it was designed to do. What happened in the next 11 seconds was difficult to reconstruct afterward, even for the people who witnessed it. It was too fast. Not film fast, not Hollywood choreographed, real fast. The unsettling fast of someone who had spent years learning to move through the bodies of other people, the way a river moves through landscape, finding the angles and the leverage points, and the places where force applied with precision does much more than brute strength can achieve. The man holding Sarah's wrist was the first. Jack was behind the counter before anyone fully registered that he'd moved. He didn't throw a punch. He applied pressure, a specific grip on a specific point on the man's forearm, and the man's hand opened involuntarily purely as a function of nerve response. And then the follow-through of the same motion carried the man's center of gravity backward and down, and he hit the floor behind the counter hard enough to shake the mugs hanging on their hooks above the station. Sarah stepped back. She wasn't unhurt. Her wrist was red where the grip had been, but she was standing and she was free, and she had the presence of mind to move to the end of the counter away from the action. The second man came from Jack's left. He was faster than the first, and he came in angry, which is always both a help and a problem. Angry men are committed, which means they move hard, and movement is something you can work with. Jack worked with it. He used the man's momentum and his own pivot and applied a very specific force to the man's shoulder that carried him past and down. The third man hesitated. That hesitation was all Jack needed. He moved into the hesitation the way you step through an open door, and then that man was down too. 3 seconds, maybe 4. 11 seconds total from the moment Sarah's wrist was grabbed to the moment Jack stepped back from the third man and straightened and stood still. He wasn't breathing hard. That was the thing people noticed afterward. He wasn't breathing hard and he wasn't emotional, and his face had the calm, expressionless quality of someone who has just completed a routine task. Dylan Cross was standing in the center of the diner, surrounded by broken furniture and shattered ceramic, and 2 of his men who were conscious and staring, and one who was still working out which direction was up. The other 9 were very, very still. Dylan looked at Jack. Jack looked at Dylan. The room was completely quiet except for the sound of coffee dripping from somewhere it shouldn't have been. "You need to get your people together," Jack said, "and you need to leave." Dylan's face ran through several expressions very quickly. Shock, disbelief, anger, and something underneath all of them that Jack recognized as fear being hurriedly covered over with something else, something harder. "Do you know who you just touched?" Dylan's voice was tight, controlled but barely. "I know they grabbed a young woman who works for me." "My guys don't get touched." Dylan's jaw was set. "Nobody touches my guys." Jack looked around the diner, at the broken things, at Roy Hendricks, who had come back in after the lunch rush to pick up a forgotten jacket and was now standing in the doorway to the back hall with his hand on the wall frame and his face very pale. At Sarah, who had both arms around herself and was watching Jack with an expression he'd never seen on her before. At the elderly couple who hadn't moved, who were holding hands across the small table with a grip that was white at the knuckles. Jack looked back at Dylan. "These are good people," Jack said quietly. "They have nothing to do with whatever brought you here. You're going to leave, and you're going to leave them alone." Something shifted in Dylan's expression. The fear he'd been covering over came up through the surface just for a moment, visible, and then something else replaced it, something colder and more deliberate. "My boss is going to hear about this," Dylan said. His voice had dropped to something almost conversational, almost casual, which was worse than shouting. "You understand what I'm telling you?" Jack said nothing. Dylan looked at the 3 men on the floor. Then he looked back at Jack. And he did something that Jack had not expected. He smiled. A slow, genuine smile that carried no warmth in it at all. "You got lucky tonight, old man," Dylan said. "But luck runs out." He turned and walked toward the door. His crew followed him. Some of them moving quickly and some of them moving carefully past the broken furniture. One of them helping the man from behind the counter, who was walking in the slightly uncertain way of someone whose body hasn't entirely caught up with the situation yet. They went out. The bell above the door rang in their wake with a cheerful brightness that was badly at odds with everything else. Jack stood in the center of the ruined dining room. He heard Roy from the back hallway let out a breath he'd been holding so long it must have been painful. He heard the elderly man at the window say to his wife quietly and firmly, "It's okay. It's okay, Miriam. It's okay." He heard Sarah's voice from the end of the counter, not quite steady. "Jack." He turned. Sarah was looking at him with that expression he'd never seen before. Like she was seeing him for the first time. Like the person she'd worked next to for 3 years and thought she understood had just revealed a dimension she hadn't known existed. It wasn't fear exactly, but it was something adjacent to it. "Jack," she said again, "who are you?" He didn't answer her. He moved to the front window and looked through the glass at the parking lot as the expensive cars pulled out onto Carlisle Street and disappeared into the dark. And he stood there for a long moment, watching the empty street, listening to the silence. Sheriff Daniel Carter arrived 14 minutes later. Someone had called 911 Roy, probably or one of the highway department men who'd been up against the wall. Carter came through the door with his hand near his hip, the way cops do when they've been given information that suggests the situation might not be resolved. And then he stopped and looked at the room and at Jack and at the 3 men who were by now sitting up on the floor with a particular expression of people who are trying to decide what story they're going to tell. "Jack," Carter said. Daniel." Carter looked at the broken furniture, at the walls, at the floor. He'd known Jack Walker for 11 years. He'd eaten at this diner at least twice a week for most of that time. He had a particular stool at the counter, second from the left, and a particular order eggs scrambled. Not over easy toast, white coffee, black, and he had never once in 11 years seen Jack be anything other than exactly what he appeared to be. He was having some difficulty integrating that history with the current scene. "You want to tell me what happened?" Carter said. 12 men came in and started destroying the place," Jack said. "I asked them to leave." Carter looked at the three men on the floor. One of them was holding his shoulder with an expression that suggested the shoulder was providing him with information he found unwelcome. And these three, they needed more convincing. Carter was quiet for a moment. Then he crossed to the counter and set his hat on the surface and sat on Roy's stool, not his own stool, which suggested he was more unsettled than he was showing, and looked at Jack. "You were in the kitchen when this started," Carter said carefully, as though he was constructing something and needed to make sure all the pieces were going in the right order. "You came out. 12 men. 3 of them you—" He paused, looked at the man with the shoulder injury, looked back at Jack. "How did that happen exactly?" "I kept them from hurting someone who works for me." "That's not what I'm asking." Jack met Carter's eyes. Carter held the look for a long moment, and what moved through his expression in that moment was something complicated. The beginnings of understanding, maybe, or the first recognition that there were questions he'd been not quite asking for 11 years, and was only now starting to formulate properly. "Jack," Carter said quietly, "who are you?" It was the same question Sarah had asked. Jack had not answered her. He didn't answer Carter either. What he did do while Carter took statements from the other witnesses was sit in one of the booths that hadn't been destroyed and hold a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking and look at the wall across from him. And what he thought about was Dylan Cross's smile as he'd walked out. The cold, purposeful smile of someone who was not done. Not even close to done. The words that moved through his mind over and over in the particular rhythm of a thing that will not stop repeating itself, he's going to tell someone. And whoever he tells is going to come back. And then another voice underneath that one, quieter and older. "You know, this was never going to stay quiet. Not after tonight. You knew that when you moved. You moved anyway because the girl was going to get hurt. You made your choice. Now you live with what comes next." Jack set the coffee cup down. It was cold by then anyway. He looked at the faded outline on the wall where a framed photo had hung for 11 years, a photo he'd taken down last spring, when the frame cracked and he hadn't gotten around to replacing it yet. It had been a picture of the diner when it first opened back in a year, when his hair was still fully brown and the sign was new, and the whole enterprise was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. He thought about who he'd been before that photo was taken. He thought about the phone in his pocket. He thought about a number he'd memorized 18 years ago and never deleted the way you keep a number you tell yourself you'll never use. Then he got up and began quietly helping clear the broken things from the floor of his diner. Outside Fairview, Montana was dark and still. The main street was empty. The street lights made yellow pools on the pavement and nothing moved through them. But out on Route 9, heading back the way they'd come, 11 men in expensive cars were reporting what had happened to the person on the other end of a phone call who received the information without apparent surprise and said only, "Find out who he is." And somewhere in the accumulated history of an old man who had tried very hard to leave his history behind, something had already shifted. Like a door that swings both ways opened from the other side. The 3 men Dylan Cross left behind didn't say much to Sheriff Carter. That itself told Carter everything he needed to know about who they were and how they operated. People who talk to law enforcement when they're sitting on the floor of a diner they just helped destroy are people who don't have a structure above them telling them to stay quiet. These 3 had a structure. They gave their names. 2 of them gave names Carter was fairly certain were false, which he noted without pressing, said they'd been involved in a misunderstanding and declined to elaborate. The man with the shoulder injury said he wanted a doctor. Carter got him one. The other 2 were released with citations for destruction of property that Carter was already fairly certain would evaporate into the court system the way these things sometimes did when the people behind them had resources. After they left, Carter sat in his cruiser in the parking lot of Walker's Diner for 20 minutes. He didn't call anything in. He didn't write anything down. He just sat there in the dark and thought about what he'd seen inside that building, running it back the way you run back footage you can't quite believe even though you watched it in real time. 12 men, 3 of them down in under 5 seconds by a 62-year-old diner owner who described what happened as keeping them from hurting someone who works for me. Carter had been in law enforcement for 27 years. He had worked with people who knew how to handle themselves. He had seen fights, real fights, not the television kind, and he understood at a functional level what it looked like when someone who was actually trained moved against someone who wasn't. What he'd seen tonight in Walker's Diner wasn't just training. It was something that training builds toward over years, decades. The kind of thing that lives in the body the way language lives in the mind, not something you remember how to do, something you simply do below the level of thought. He pulled out of the parking lot and drove to the office. And then instead of going home the way he should have at 10:15 on a Tuesday night, he sat down at his desk and opened his computer and started looking. He started with what he knew: Jack Walker, Fairview, Montana, 18 years. For that, nothing. Not nothing unusual, nothing. No employment records before the diner. No previous Montana addresses. A social security number that checked out but had no history attached to it before a certain date. The kind of clean slate number that could mean several things, and most of them were not boring. Carter leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. Then he started making calls. He had a contact in Billings who worked organized crime task force, a woman named Reyes, who owed him a favor from something 3 years ago that neither of them had ever put in writing. He called her cell knowing she'd probably be asleep, and she answered on the third ring with the voice of someone who had been awake but would deny it. Reyes, Carter said, "I've got an identity question. Someone local, clean record, but the background stops cold about 18 years back. I need to know if this is a witness protection situation or something else." Reyes was quiet for a moment. "You gonna tell me who? Jack Walker, Fairview." Another pause, longer this time. Carter heard her shift position. "Spell it." He spelled it. He heard typing. Then nothing for so long he checked to see if the call had dropped. "Reyes, I'm here." Her voice had changed, just slightly. The quality of professional distance that law enforcement people use when they're processing information they weren't expecting. "Jack Walker is a clean name, nothing attached." "I know that. That's why I'm calling you." "I mean, the name is clean all the way down, Carter. Not suppressed, not flagged, not linked to anything. Whoever set that identity up did it very thoroughly." She paused again. "The question you should be asking isn't who he is, it's who he was. And that question is going to take me longer than tonight." Carter said he understood. He hung up and sat at his desk for a while longer, and then he drove home and lay in bed and thought about Jack Walker moving through those 3 men like they weren't there. Across town, Jack was not sleeping either. He'd closed the diner an hour after Carter left. He'd swept the floor himself, moving the broken pieces of 18 years of ordinary life into trash bags with a methodical care that had more to do with doing something with his hands than with any urgency about the mess itself. Sarah had stayed to help, and they'd worked mostly in silence, and he'd noticed that she was keeping a certain distance from him that she hadn't kept before tonight. Not fear, not quite, but recalibration. The way you recalibrate your understanding of a space after something unexpected happens in it. When the worst of it was cleared, Sarah had stood by the door with her coat on and her bag over her shoulder and looked at him. "You going to tell me?" she asked. "Tell you what? Don't." She said it without sharpness, without anger, just with the particular exhaustion of someone who's been trying to let something go and finding they can't. "Don't do that. I've worked with you for 3 years, Jack. I know when you're deflecting." Jack set down the trash bag in his hand. He looked at her. Really looked at her, not the managed glance he'd been giving her since Carter left, the kind of look that processes enough information to respond appropriately without revealing anything. "What do you want to know?" he said. "What happened tonight?" She held his eyes. "Not the part where you put 3 men on the floor." "I saw that part. I want to know how you knew exactly what to do. Because what I saw you do tonight, Jack, that's not something you learn in a diner." He was quiet for a long moment. "Go home, Sarah," he said. "Lock your door." Her expression shifted. The recalibration moved into something sharper. "Are we in danger?" He considered lying to her. He considered it seriously, the way you consider things you know you're not going to do, but that are still tempting precisely because they would make a hard moment easier. "I don't know yet," he said. That was the truth. He owed her the truth. Sarah looked at him for a long, still moment. Then she nodded once with the small, precise nod of someone who has made a decision about how to handle what they've just been told, and she left. Jack locked the front door behind her and stood in the empty diner. In a restaurant that had been full of people 12 hours ago, the absence of them now had a physical quality. Sound carries differently in empty spaces. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Something settled in the walls. He went to the back of the diner, past the kitchen, through the storage room, to the door that led down 3 steps to the basement space he used for dry storage and equipment overflow, and in one specific corner, nothing that had anything to do with the diner. There was a section of the basement behind the water heater where 2 cases of bulk tomato cans sat against the wall. Jack moved them. Behind them was a section of wall that looked identical to every other section of wall down there. He pressed in 2 specific places and the panel gave, and behind it was a space roughly the size of a large closet that smelled of dust and old leather and something else, something chemical and cool in particular. The smell of things that had been stored carefully and kept dry for a very long time. He stood in the opening for a moment, then he stepped in. The box was where he'd left it. He'd checked it twice in 18 years, once at the 5-year mark, when he was far enough from the old life to check on it without the check feeling like a return, and once 7 years ago, when he'd convinced himself he was going to dispose of everything in it and had stood exactly where he was standing now and found that he couldn't. He sat on the floor with the box in front of him and opened it. The leather vest was folded on top. He didn't touch it. He looked at it the way you look at a photograph of someone you used to be with. Recognition, but also with the comfortable distance of the person you've become. The patches on the vest were faded to the point where they were barely distinguishable as specific images, which suited Jack fine. He hadn't looked at them closely in 18 years and didn't want to start now. Beneath the vest was the photograph. He picked this one up. 5 men. Standing in front of motorcycles he couldn't clearly make out, though he remembered them without needing the image to remind him. The man on the left was him, younger by decades, harder in the face, different in some quality that was difficult to name, but that had everything to do with how he held his body in relation to the world around him, like something always ready to happen. He looked at the man standing next to him in the photograph, taller, gray at the temples even then. A face that had spent a lot of time in weather and had adjusted to it the way stone adjusts to rain, not softened or more defined by it. His name was Mac. Jack hadn't thought about Mac in years, and thinking about him now produced a particular feeling that sat somewhere between grief and guilt, and the very specific ache of something you let go of. Not because you stopped caring about it, but because keeping it would have destroyed you. He put the photograph back in the box. Then he reached beneath it, beneath the other things he didn't look at, and found what he was actually looking for, a piece of paper folded 3 times and creased with age. He unfolded it. A phone number written in his own handwriting from 18 years ago, the digits slightly faded but still legible. He sat with it in his hand for a long time. The thing about that number was that calling it meant something. Not just making contact, it meant acknowledging that the situation was serious enough to require the kind of help that number represented. It meant dropping a flare in a location he had worked very hard to make invisible. It meant letting people know where he was. He refolded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket. He put the box back, replaced the panel, moved the tomato cans back into position, and then he went upstairs and sat at the counter of his empty diner and listened to the dark outside, and after a long time he took out his actual phone and the piece of paper and dialed. It rang 4 times. 5. He'd half decided no one was going to answer when the line connected. Silence. Then a voice hoarse with sleep or years or both. Who is this? Not a question. A statement with the specific inflection of someone who screens calls and means for unknown numbers to understand they're on trial. It's Ghost, Jack said. The word felt foreign in his mouth, like speaking a language he had stopped dreaming in. Another silence, different quality this time. Then Ghost. Yeah, Ghost is dead. The voice was flat, careful. I was at the service. There wasn't a service. No. A pause. No, there wasn't. And in the breathing on the other end of that line, Jack could hear something shift. The careful flatness opened just slightly. Where are you, Palm, Montana? How long at home? 18 years. Jesus, a long exhale. 18 years. Mac, Jack said. I need to know if the name Dylan Cross means anything. The pause that followed was short, but it was the kind of short pause that comes not from not knowing something, but from deciding how much of what you know to say. Where'd that name come from? Mac asked. He walked into my place tonight, brought 12 men, tore it up. He know who you are. He knew my name, my current name. He knew something because he wasn't surprised when I... Jack stopped, reconsidered the sentence. He wasn't surprised by how it went. But he didn't know about before. He didn't act like it. He acted like he had leverage I didn't know about. He said his boss would hear about it. Jack paused. I need to know who his boss is, Mac. Another silence, longer this time. Jack could hear something in the background on Mac's end, a television or a radio, or just the ambient sound of a place where multiple people lived. It struck him with the oddness that distance sometimes produces that he had no idea where Mac was. He'd assumed the old territory. He might have been wrong about that. Dylan Cross, Mac said finally, is a problem that other people have been trying to solve for about 2 years. He's not Hell's Angels. He's not any of the organizations you'd know. He's what happens when a man with money and no loyalty builds his own structure. His boss is a man named Vernon Holt. And Vernon Holt Ghost, this is the part I need you to hear. Vernon Holt knows names, old names, he collects them. It's how he operates, it's how he gets leverage. And if his people found you in Montana, it's because someone in that man's organization has been doing homework. Jack was quiet. He doesn't know who I was, Jack said, but it wasn't entirely a statement. Not yet. Mac's voice was careful, deliberate. But Ghost, once Dylan reports what happened tonight, and he will report it because Dylan Cross doesn't eat a loss quietly, Vernon Holt is going to go looking. And if he goes looking hard enough, he'll find it. He'll find it. Jack closed his eyes briefly. In the dark behind his eyelids was the dining room he'd built over 18 years. The smell of coffee and breakfast, the weight of a life he'd constructed, with the specific and patient intention of a man who understood what he was walking away from and wanted to walk far enough that it would never find him. I need to know what you know about his operation, Jack said. Jack. It was the first time Mac had used his actual name. The effect was quietly startling. You understand what you're asking. You call this number, you're not just making a call. You know what this means in terms of, I know what it means. You're sure because 18 years is a long time to be out. You don't just, Mac. Jack's voice was quiet and absolute. 3 of his men grabbed my waitress tonight. She's 25 years old. She has nothing to do with any of this. I need to know what's coming so I can protect the people in this town. Silence. Then Max said with the tone of a man making a decision he's already made and is only now allowing himself to acknowledge, give me 24 hours. I don't know if I have 24 hours. You have more than you think. Dylan's embarrassed right now. Embarrassed men need to manage their embarrassment before they escalate. He's going to report to Vernon, and he's going to do it in a way that makes himself look better than tonight actually went. That'll take time. Give me 24 hours, Ghost. I'll know more than he does by the time I call you back. Jack sat with that. 24 hours, he said. And Jack, one more pause. Don't be alone. I know that's not how you like to operate, but don't be alone right now. The call ended. Jack set the phone on the counter and looked at it for a long time, and what he felt in that moment was something he hadn't felt in so long. He'd almost forgotten the shape of it. The precise and humming awareness of a situation in motion, a situation with forces moving through it that were larger than one person moving toward a conclusion that was not yet determined, but was becoming less avoidable with every hour. He knew that feeling. He'd lived in it for years. He didn't want to feel it again. But there it was. The next morning he opened the diner at 5:30. The repairs he'd managed to make the night before were adequate. The floor was clear. The functional tables were serviceable. The worst of the visible damage was behind the counter, where customers wouldn't immediately see it. He'd taped cardboard over the broken window section and told himself he'd call about glass later in the day. Roy Hendricks came in at 6:10. Roy sat on his stool and looked at the cardboard in the window and at the missing tables and at the unfamiliar, careful way Jack was moving around the kitchen, which was the same as Jack's usual way, but with something underneath it that Roy, who had known Jack for 11 years, was sensitive enough to detect without being able to name. Coffee, Jack, Roy said. Jack poured it. You going to tell me anything? Roy asked. About what? Roy picked up his mug. About why I spent the night lying awake thinking about you for the first time in 11 years. Jack leaned against the counter across from Roy. He looked at the old man, the careful eyes, the hands around the mug, the way Roy's face had settled with age into something that had more honesty in it than most younger faces managed. I'm handling it, Jack said. That's not what I asked. Roy, Jack held the man's eyes. I need you to trust me. Roy was quiet for a moment. He looked at his coffee, then he looked back up. I trust you, Roy said. I've trusted you for 11 years. I'm asking you to tell me if I need to be worried about the people in this town. Jack straightened. He considered the question seriously, the way it deserved to be considered. I don't know yet, he said, but I'm going to find out. And I will not let anything happen to this town. You understand me? Roy looked at him for a long, quiet moment. And in Roy's face, Jack could see him doing the same thing Sarah had done the night before, the same thing Carter had done, recalibrating, adjusting the model he'd carried for years to accommodate new information that didn't fit the old shape. Okay, Roy said. Okay, Jack. And he picked up his coffee and drank it. And neither of them said anything else, and outside the morning came up slow and gray over Fairview, and the cardboard patch in the window held against the cold. By 9 o'clock, Carter was back at the diner. He came in through the front and sat at his stool and didn't take off his hat, which meant he wasn't here as a regular. I made some calls last night, Carter said. I figured you might. Carter looked at him levelly. Your name stops at the same year you opened this place. Does it? Jack. Carter lowered his voice, which in the nearly empty diner was more about register than actual volume. I'm not looking to cause you problems. I've known you 11 years. I know who you are. What I don't know is who you were, and right now that feels like a gap I need to close. He paused. Because whatever happened last night, the 3 men I processed and released, those aren't local criminals. They're connected to something organized, and my contact in Billings is telling me this organization has been causing serious problems across 3 states. And she is telling me that the man in charge is not someone who accepts losses without a response. Jack looked at him. Vernon Holt, Jack said. Carter went very still. You know that name? I made some calls too. Carter's jaw tightened slightly. Jack, Daniel. Jack leaned forward slightly, keeping his voice low and even. I need you to let me handle the parts of this you can't reach. I will give you everything you need to build a legal case against Dillon and Cross and his crew. I will give you the information that puts them away properly. But I need you to trust that I know what I'm doing, and I need you to not ask me questions I can't answer in ways that would be good for either of us. Carter stared at him. The clock on the wall ticked. From the kitchen, the sound of the grill. How bad is it going to get? Carter asked finally. Jack thought about Mac's voice on the phone. He thought about Vernon Holt, a name he'd now heard twice in the 12 hours, and which was accumulating weight with each repetition, the way names do when they belong to people who cause damage. I don't know yet, Jack said, for the 3rd time that morning. But I'll know more soon. Carter sat back. He picked up the coffee Jack had poured without being asked and held it without drinking it. He looked out through the cardboard patched window at the street. You know the part that bothers me most, Carter said. Tell me. Last night, watching you. Carter shook his head slightly. I've seen trained men, Jack. Military, special operations. I've worked with them. What you did last night. He stopped, started again. Who were you? Jack looked at the sheriff. At this man who had eaten at his counter twice a week for 11 years, who had 3 kids and a wife who made the best pie in the county, and who had spent his career trying to protect a small town that mostly tried to take care of itself. This man who was looking at him now with the careful, honest eyes of someone who understood he was standing at the edge of something he didn't fully see. I was someone who hurt people, Jack said quietly, and then I stopped. Carter held his eyes for a long moment. And now, Carter said, now I protect them. Jack picked up the coffee pot and refilled Carter's cup, even though it was still mostly full. Let me do my job, Daniel. Carter left 20 minutes later without saying much else, and Jack watched the cruiser pull out from the window and then turned back to the diner and the work of the day which went on around him, the way ordinary life goes on around the things that are actually happening inside a person. By noon, Sarah was back. She came in through the back as usual, and she stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Jack, working the grill, and she didn't say good morning. What she said was, I Googled motorcycle gangs last night. Jack flipped the order on the grill without turning around. What did you find? Enough to understand why you wouldn't want people to know. She came the rest of the way into the kitchen and stood close enough that she could keep her voice down. Jack, I'm not asking you to tell me everything. I'm asking you to tell me enough so I know how scared to be. He turned around. She looked tired. Not slept badly, tired, but the specific fatigue that comes from spending a night thinking very hard about something. There were shadows under her eyes and her hair was pulled back with less care than usual, and she was looking at him with a directness that reminded him not for the first time that she was considerably tougher than her 25 years might suggest. You should be careful, he said. For now, go straight home after your shift. Don't go anywhere alone. That's not a number on a scale of 1 to 10. Sarah, I'm not a child, she said. I'm a person who has been working for you for 3 years, and last night, someone grabbed my arm in your diner, and I have the right to know whether I need to be afraid to come back here. Jack was quiet for a moment. In the kitchen, the grill hissed. Something was cooking that needed attention, and he ignored it. You need to be careful, he said, not terrified. Careful. He held her eyes. I am not going to let anything happen to you. You can't promise that. No, he agreed. But I can tell you that I'm better at keeping people safe than I look. Sarah held his gaze for another moment. Then something in her expression shifted, not relaxed exactly, but settled. The kind of settling that happens when a person decides to trust someone even without having all the information they'd prefer to have. Okay, she said quietly. Okay, Jack said. She turned to go back to the floor. Then she stopped. Jack, she said without turning around, whoever you used to be, you didn't have to come through that kitchen door last night. Nobody would have blamed you for staying in the back. He didn't say anything. That's all, she said and pushed through to the floor. Jack turned back to the grill. He stood there for a moment without doing anything, just standing his hands at his sides, feeling the heat from the surface. And what moved through him then was something he didn't have a clean word for, something in the neighborhood of gratitude or relief, or the particular ache of being seen by someone without flinching. He got back to work. At 3:17 in the afternoon, his phone rang. Unknown number. He stared at it through 2 rings and then answered. I told you 24 hours, Max said. I didn't say they were going to be the 24 you expected. Jack was in the storage room. He'd come back here as soon as the phone had started ringing, the old instinct for privacy reasserting itself without conscious thought. What happened? Jack said. Dylan reported back to Vernon last night like I said he would, but he didn't tell Vernon what actually went down. He told Vernon that you had backup, that you'd set a trap, that there were other people involved. Jack processed this. He was embarrassed. He was mortified, so he made up a story where what happened wasn't that one 62-year-old diner owner put 3 of his guys down and backed his whole crew out of the door. He told Vernon you had armed people in the back. He told Vernon you were connected. So now Vernon thinks someone is using you as a front, that your diner is a front for something. He thinks there's an operation in Fairview he doesn't know about. Mac paused, which from Vernon's perspective is not acceptable. He doesn't like unknown quantities on the map. Jack felt something drop through him, cold and specific. He's coming himself, Jack said. Not a question. He's sending people ahead first. My read is 48 hours, maybe 72. But Ghost and I need you to hear this clearly. Vernon Holt doesn't send a cleanup crew. He sends a message team. What he does to places he decides need a message is not subtle. He's burned buildings. He's put people in hospitals. He has done things in 3 states that law enforcement has been trying to build a case around for 2 years. Jack stood in the dark of his storage room with the phone against his ear and thought about the morning regulars. He thought about Roy on his stool. He thought about the Dunmore sisters who split their pancakes on Saturday mornings. He thought about the teenager who'd been sitting at the counter last night with his homework. Mac, Jack said, yeah. I need more than information. A silence, the longest one yet. I know, Mac said. I know you do. Another silence. There are people, Jack, people who remember, people who owe you debts they've been carrying a long time. He stopped. Some of them are closer to Montana than you'd think. Jack leaned against the wall in the dark. This isn't what I wanted, he said. No, Max said, but it's what is. A pause. You didn't start this. I know. And Ghost. Mac's voice had changed. Underneath the careful practicality of everything he'd said, something older and more direct had surfaced. You've been running 18 years. You know what I've learned about running. Jack waited. Eventually, Max said, "You either stop running or you fall." The line went quiet for a moment. "Make the call," Max said. "You know the number." The call ended. Jack stood in the storage room for 60 seconds exactly. He counted. The old way, the way he trained himself to take 60 seconds before acting on any significant decision, because 60 seconds changed the quality of the decision without changing the decision itself. He'd learned that a long time ago, and it had served him. He stood in the dark of his storage room and breathed and counted, and when 60 seconds were up, he walked back through the kitchen and asked Sarah to cover the counter for a while, and he went out the back door into the cold October afternoon. He walked 2 blocks from the diner. Old habit, don't make the call from your own location. Then he took out the folded piece of paper. Not the number he'd called last night. A different number. Below it, written in the same hand but in darker ink, written later. Written at a moment when he'd made a decision he thought he would never need to act on. He dialed. It rang once. "Yeah," said a voice. "This is Ghostwriter," Jack said, "and I need to call in the debt." The voice on the other end went very still. Then quietly, with the weight of something that had been waiting to be said for a very long time. "Tell me where you are." The voice on the other end of the line belonged to a man named Ruiz. Jack hadn't spoken to Ruiz in 16 years, but the voice was exactly the same, low and unhurried, with the particular quality of a man who had never needed volume to make himself understood. Ruiz was the kind of person who could say 3 words in a quiet room and have everyone in it paying attention before the 3rd word landed. "Fairview, Montana," Jack said. "Walker's Diner on Carlisle Street." A pause that wasn't hesitation. Ruiz didn't hesitate. It was the pause of a man receiving information and filing it in the correct place. "How long do you have?" Ruiz asked. 48 hours, maybe 72. "Who is it?" "Vernon Holt." The pause this time was different. Not longer, but denser. "You're sure?" Ruiz said. "My information is solid." "Vernon Holt doesn't go to places personally," Ruiz said. "He sends people who make a point." Loudly. "I know. And you're in a small town, with people I'm not willing to see get hurt." Ruiz was quiet for exactly the span of time it takes a man to make a significant decision, and then he said, "I'll make some calls." "How many people?" "As many as need to come." Ruiz's voice had the flat certainty of someone who had spent years being the person other people called when the situation had moved beyond ordinary handling. "Ghost, you called in the debt. You understand what that means in terms of what I'm authorized to bring." Jack understood. He'd always understood. It was why he hadn't called for 18 years, even when there had been lesser situations where calling would have been justified. Because calling Ruiz wasn't like calling for backup. Calling Ruiz was like opening a door that had a very specific kind of gravity. On the other side, things came through it, and the shape of everything after was different from the shape of everything before. "I understand," Jack said. "Then sit tight." And Jack, a pause. "Don't do anything to provoke Holt's people before we get there. If they're running surveillance, and they will be running surveillance, do not give them a reason to move early." The call ended. Jack stood on the sidewalk, 2 blocks from the diner in the cold afternoon air, and held the phone in his hand for a moment before putting it back in his pocket. Then he walked back. The diner was quiet when he came through the back door. Sarah was at the counter with a damp cloth wiping down the surface with the particular focused attention of someone who is keeping herself busy to avoid thinking about something. She looked up when he came in and immediately read something in his face, because that was the thing about Sarah. She watched people the way other people watch television, with genuine investment in what was actually being communicated. And Jack had stopped being able to hide things from her about 2 years into working together. "You made a call," she said. 2 of them. And Jack came around behind the counter and poured himself coffee he didn't need and leaned against the back counter and looked at her. "I need you to do something for me," he said, "and I need you to do it without asking me the parts of it you're going to want to ask." Sarah put down the cloth. "What is it?" "I need you to call the people you care about in this town and find a reason for them to spend the next 2 or 3 days somewhere other than Fairview. Your family, anyone close to you. I need them not to be here." The color changed in Sarah's face. Not dramatically, she wasn't a person who went pale or flushed in obvious ways, but something in the quality of her expression shifted into a register that was very serious and very still. "How bad?" she said. "I don't know exactly. I'm doing everything I can to prevent it from being bad at all." But I want the people you love out of the path of it just in case. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. Her mother lived 20 minutes outside of Fairview, in a house on her sister's property. Her father had died 4 years ago. She had two friends who were the closest thing she had to family after her actual family, and one of them, a woman named Becca, lived 3 houses down from the diner. What do I tell them? Sarah asked. Tell them whatever you need to tell them, Jack said. Be creative. Something moved through Sarah's face that was almost in another context, the beginning of a smile. Then it settled back into seriousness. And me, she said. I'd tell you to go too, Jack said, but I don't think you will. No, she said. I won't. He'd known that. He'd known it before he said it. He nodded once. Then stay close to me, he said. Stay into the diner. Don't go anywhere alone. And Sarah, if I tell you to go to the back and stay there, you go. No questions. No. Okay, she said. Simple and absolute. The way she'd said it the night before. He looked at her, the diner, the counter, the coffee pot she'd set down, the cardboard patch in the window behind her. The ordinary architecture of a life he'd built over 18 years. Thank you, he said. For what? He didn't answer that. He took his coffee to the kitchen and got back to work, because that was what you did. You worked. You kept moving. You didn't let the waiting pull you under. The rest of the afternoon passed with the specific quality of time that knows something is coming. Every customer who came in felt slightly unreal, like people walking through the frame of a photograph. Jack took their orders and cooked their food and refilled their coffee and did it all with the practiced ease of 18 years of practice. And underneath all of it, he was running the information he had like a hand of cards. Mac's intelligence about Vernon Holt's response, Ruiz's promise of people coming, Carter's knowledge of the organized crime investigation, Dylan's inflated report that had told Holt there was an unknown operation in Fairview. The card he kept coming back to was that last one. Dylan had lied to his boss, which meant Holt was going to arrive or send people expecting a confrontation with an organized group. What he was actually going to find was one diner, one 62-year-old man, a sheriff with limited jurisdiction, and whatever Ruiz was going to bring. The gap between Vernon Holt's expectations and the reality of Fairview was either a dangerous misalignment or the most useful thing Jack had going for him. He hadn't decided which yet. Carter came back at 5:30. He didn't sit down this time. He stood at the counter and leaned on it with both forearms and looked at Jack from under the brim of his hat with the expression of a man who had spent the day doing things he wasn't entirely comfortable with and wanted credit for it. I've been in touch with the organized crime unit in Billings, Carter said. They've had a file on Vernon Holt for 22 months. They've been building toward a racketeering case, and there are about 60 to 70% there. What they're missing is physical evidence linking Holt directly to the incidents. They have his people for most of it, but Holt is careful about keeping his name off anything that could be documented. Jack looked at him. What are you telling me? I'm telling you that if something happens here in Fairview, if Holt or his people do something here, that's on the record, it could give them what they need to close the case. You're telling me you want to use this town as a trap? Carter's jaw tightened. I'm telling you that if it's going to happen anyway, we might as well be positioned to turn it into something that prevents it from happening to 12 other towns after this one. Jack was quiet for a moment. He looked at the counter. He looked at the coffee pot. He thought about what Mac had said about Vernon Holt burning buildings and putting people in hospitals. I won't let this town be a stage, Jack said. Nobody here is going to get hurt for someone else's case file. That's not what I know what you're doing, Jack said. And the intention is right, the approach isn't. He looked at Carter. But the information might still be useful. What does the unit need? Carter blinked. He hadn't expected that pivot. Financial documentation, a direct communication from Holt ordering an action, something that puts his decisions on the record. That's something I might be able to get you, Jack, through channels that have nothing to do with you or anyone in your department. Jack held Carter's eyes. You're going to have to trust me again. Carter held his gaze for a long moment. Then he straightened up. You know what I realized today, Carter said. 11 years of knowing you. Not one story about your life before the diner. Not one. Most people, you know them a year and you know their whole history. Parents, childhood first job, first heartbreak. You never once, he stopped. It should have struck me sooner. People don't share what they're trying to leave behind, Jack said. Carter looked at him with something that was not quite judgment and not quite understanding, and landed somewhere between the two. "I'm going to increase patrols on Carlisle Street," Carter said, "and I'm going to need you to call me the absolute minute anything changes." "You'll be the second call I make," Jack said. "Who's the first?" Jack picked up the coffee pot and turned back to the counter. Carter left without pushing it. At 7:45 that evening, Roy came back. He'd already been in that morning, and there was no particular reason for him to return at night, which meant he had a particular reason to return at night. He sat on his stool and waited until the counter cleared, until the last of the dinner customers had paid and gone, and then he looked at Jack with the direct simplicity of a man who had decided on his approach and was going to take it. "I'm 71 years old," Roy said. "I've lived in Fairview my entire life. I watched this town handle things people said couldn't be handled. And I've watched you for 11 years be the kind of man this town is lucky to have in it." He picked up the coffee Jack poured without him asking. "I'm not asking you what's coming. I'm asking you what you need." Jack stopped. He looked at Roy, this old man with his bad knees and his daughter in Billings and his coffee taken without sugar since the doctor's news. "Roy," he said, "go home." "That's not what Roy." Jack set the pot down. He looked at the old man steadily. "You have been a good friend to me, and the best thing you can do for me right now is go home, lock your door, and stay there for a few days. I mean it." Roy looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that takes the full measure of a person. "You got people coming?" Roy asked. Jack said nothing. "Because the way you said that," Roy said slowly, "that's not the voice of a man who's handling something alone. That's the voice of a man who's managing a situation. There's a difference." He held Jack's eyes. "You've got people coming." Jack held the silence for exactly as long as he could afford to. "Go home, Roy," he said, "please." Roy drained his coffee. He set the mug on the counter with the particular careful deliberateness of an old man making a point through a gesture. Then he stood up. "You're a good man, Jack Walker," Roy said, "whatever your name is." And he walked out, and the bell over the door rang behind him, and Jack stood at the counter and breathed for a moment before starting to wipe it down. The first of them arrived at 11:14 that night. Jack was in the kitchen doing the final close down when he heard the motorcycles. He didn't go to the window. He'd been expecting this and had decided not to go to the window because going to the window was a reaction, and he was not in the business of reacting tonight. He finished what he was doing, dried his hands, and walked to the front door and unlocked it and stepped outside. There were two of them, older men, both of them with the particular physical quality of people who have spent years in situations that required them to be very present and very capable, and who had not let that quality diminish with age. One of them was tall and lean with a gray beard cut close and eyes that moved with the habitual attention of someone who was always clocking what was around them. The other was shorter and broader and had a quality of absolute stillness about him, the kind of stillness that isn't passive but loaded like a spring that's fully compressed. The tall one looked at Jack for a moment. "You look older," he said. 16 years will do that," Jack said. The shorter one looked at the diner, at the cardboard patch in the window. His jaw moved slightly. "This is what started it," he said. "This is where it started," Jack said. "Come inside." They came in, and Jack made coffee, and the three of them sat at the counter. And what happened in the next 40 minutes was less a conversation than a briefing, precise, detailed, conducted in the half-verbal shorthand of people who share enough history and operational background that full sentences are optional. Their names were Deacon and Puller. Jack had worked beside both of them in a previous iteration of his life, and the specific quality of trust that exists between people who have been in genuinely dangerous situations together doesn't go away, with time the way other things do. It sits in the body, it reasserts itself the moment that people are back in the same room. Deacon had been tracking Vernon Holt's organization independently for 8 months for reasons he described briefly and without elaboration. What he knew about Holt's operational patterns was detailed and current, and as he laid it out for Jack, what became clear was that Holt's response to the Fairview situation was already further along than Mac's intelligence had suggested. "He's not waiting 48 hours, Deacon said. He moved up the timeline. Dillon's report got back to him 6 hours ago, and Holt doesn't like what he heard." "What did he hear?" Jack asked. He heard that whoever is operating out of your diner has enough people and enough capability that 12 of Dylan's men walked away from it. He doesn't know who you are yet. His research people are good, but they haven't gotten through the identity layer. But he knows something is here that he doesn't know about, and that bothers him deeply. Deacon paused. He's sending 30 men. Not tomorrow. Tonight. Jack was still. Puller, who had said almost nothing until this point, looked up from his coffee. How many people do we have? Jack said. Ruiz is pulling in everyone in range, Deacon said. But some of them are 12 hours out, some are more. How many are here now? Us, Puller said, short and without apology. Jack looked at the clock. Then he looked at the cardboard in the window. He thought about 30 men in a 12-hour gap in Fairview, Montana at night. Then we have work to do, he said. The first thing was Carter. Jack called him at 11:40. Carter answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been awake, which meant his instincts were working. They're moving tonight, Jack said without preamble. Not tomorrow, tonight. 30 men. I need you to clear Carlisle Street. Clear it how, Carter's voice was tight and immediate sleep voice, gone completely. Make something up. Gas leak, water main, anything that gets people off that block without causing a panic. Jack. Daniel. Jack's voice was quiet and absolute. Please. A silence. Brief and full of things Carter wasn't saying. Give me 20 minutes, Carter said. He gave him 20 minutes and Carter used them. Jack had to give the man credit. He used them with real efficiency, pulling in his 2 night shift deputies and fabricating a municipal emergency with the competence of someone who had spent decades managing the gap between what was actually happening and what the public needed to hear in order for things to go smoothly. Carlisle Street was not empty within 20 minutes, but it was closer to empty than it had been, and the people remaining on it were behind closed doors and unaware of what was actually coming. Deacon had been on the phone for most of those 20 minutes. When he put it away, he looked at Jack with an expression that was not alarming, but was not reassuring either. We have 3 more coming, he said, 2 hours out. What about Ruiz? Ruiz has 7 people, 4 hours. Jack did the arithmetic. 30 men a diner on the main street of a small town, and the gap between what was coming and what was available to meet it. Tell me about Holt's people, he said. Organized but not professional, Deacon said, in the military sense. They're capable and they're violent, but they're not disciplined the way trained people are. They make noise, they escalate, they rely on numbers and reputation. So they'll announce themselves. They always do, Deacon said. It's part of the message. Good, Jack said. Puller looked at him. We need them to announce themselves loudly enough that there's a documented record before anyone does anything, Jack said. For Carter's case, for the Billings unit, Deacon looked at him with something that might have been appreciation. So you want them to walk in first, Deacon said, before we show ourselves. I want them to walk in and make their position clear on the record, Jack said. And then I want to change the record. Puller set his coffee mug down. He looked at Deacon. Some communication passed between them in the particular noiseless language of people who have worked together long enough to have a vocabulary that doesn't require words. All right, Puller said, what's the plan? They spent 40 minutes on it. Not a plan in the conventional elaborate sense. This was not a situation for elaborate and over-planning in fast-moving situations, was a trap Jack had learned to avoid a very long time ago. What they built was a framework, positions, contingencies, decision points, and the specific understanding that any plan would begin dissolving the moment contact happened, and that adaptability was worth more than complexity. Sarah came downstairs at 1 a.m. She had an apartment above the diner, something Jack had arranged years ago as a convenience that had since become more important to him for the simple reason of knowing she was close, that he could hear her moving around above him on evenings when the diner was otherwise empty. She came through the door from the stairwell that connected to the back of the diner and stopped when she saw Deacon and Puller at the counter. She looked at them. She looked at Jack. I could hear voices, she said. I told you to stay upstairs. You told me a lot of things tonight. She looked at Deacon and Puller again at the leather vests they were both wearing, at the specific quality they both had of men who were very comfortable in a situation that most people would not be comfortable in. Are these your people? Yes, Jack said. She looked at them for another moment. Then she looked back at Jack, and with something in her eyes that he recognized, not fear, not even close to fear anymore. Something else, something that had resolved over the past hours from uncertainty into something harder and calmer. "What do you need me to do?" she said. "Go back upstairs." "Jack," she folded her arms. "I am 25 years old and not 12. I can answer a phone. I can document things. I can be a second set of eyes. Tell me what I can actually do, or I'm going to find something to do on my own initiative, and you probably won't like that better." Deacon across the counter made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but lived in the same neighborhood. Jack looked at Sarah for a long moment. The stubbornness in her face was real, but underneath it was also the real thing, genuine steadiness, the kind that isn't bravado, the kind that comes from a person knowing their own limits and not performing beyond them. "You have your phone," Jack said, "always. If anything happens that Carter needs to know about you, call him directly. His personal cell, not dispatch. I'll give you the number. You stay on the second floor away from the windows. You document everything you can see from the interior without going near the glass." He held her eyes. "You do not come downstairs for any reason until I come get you personally. Not another voice, not the sound of things being resolved. Me, in person." Sarah held his gaze. "Okay," she said. No argument, no pushback. He wrote Carter's number on the inside of her wrist with a pen from the counter. An old method. Reliable. She looked at it and then looked at him, and for just a moment, beneath the seriousness of everything, something else moved across her face, something more personal, more difficult to categorize. Then it was gone, and she turned and went back up the stairs, and Jack heard her footsteps crossing above him, stopping, and then the particular quiet that meant she was in position. At 2:17 in the morning, Deacon's phone buzzed. He looked at it, then at Jack. 20 minutes, Deacon said. Jack was sitting on a stool at the counter. He'd been sitting there for 40 minutes, very still, doing something that wasn't quite meditation, but occupied the same inner space, a complete and deliberate settling of everything that could be settled, so that what remained was only the clear surface of attention. He looked at Deacon. 3 more of ours, he asked. 40 minutes out, Deacon said. I know. It's fine, Jack said. Puller looked at him. You're not worried. I'm managing what's in front of me, Jack said. Worry is for the time before you know exactly what's happening. We know exactly what's happening. Puller looked at Deacon. Deacon looked at his coffee. He was always like this, Deacon said to no one in particular. They heard the vehicles before they saw them. The particular sound of multiple engines moving in convoy. Not motorcycles this time, but trucks and SUVs, the kind of vehicles that said organized movement rather than individual arrival. Carter's voice came through on the radio. I've got a convoy turning onto Carlisle from the south end, counting 12 vehicles. Could be more. Jack keyed the radio. Hold your position, Daniel. Do not move in. Let them come to the diner. Jack, if you move in now, it's a roadside stop and they walk. Let them make their statement. Then you have something. A pause. Carter's breathing on the radio. You have 30 seconds to tell me you know what you're doing, Carter said. I know what I'm doing. Another pause. 30 seconds is up, Carter said, and then quietly with the sound of a man committing to something he wasn't fully comfortable with. Standing by. Jack set down the radio and stood up from the stool. Deacon and Puller moved to their positions without being told. That was the thing about people who had operated together at that level. The choreography was internal, pre-existing, activated rather than learned. Jack walked to the front door of the diner. He unlocked it. He stood behind it and waited. The vehicle stopped. He could hear them outside engines cutting one by one. The sound of doors, boots on pavement voices, kept low. Organized. They were organized. Deacon had been right about that. But there was something in the quality of the organization that was performative, that was about display rather than genuine operational discipline. These were men who had been told they were going to make an impression, and they believed it. The front door opened. The man who came through at first was not Dylan Cross. He was older, bigger, with a face that had been in some number of hard situations and had accumulated the evidence. He wore the expression of someone who has been sent to deliver a message and is aware that the message carries the sender's authority. He looked at Jack. He looked at the empty diner. He looked at the counter, the kitchen beyond the single light that was on over the pass-through. Jack Walker, the man said. That's right, Jack said. My name is Carver. I work for Vernon Holt. He said it the way people say things they expect to have an effect. You've caused a problem. I asked some men to leave my diner, Jack said. They'd been breaking things. You put 3 of our people on the ground. They grabbed one of my employees. Carver looked at him with the careful attention of someone who has been told to read a situation and report back, and who is currently revising his reading. Where are the rest of your people? Carver said. I'm sorry. Dylan said you had. Dylan lied to his boss, Jack said simply, to save his pride. There were no other people. It was just me. Carver looked at him for a long, slow moment, and something moved in his expression that was the beginning of understanding of something, a recalibration, though he wasn't yet sure of the shape of what he was recalibrating toward. Just you, Carver repeated. Just me, Jack said. The silence stretched. Behind Carver through the open door, Jack could hear the sound of the men Carver had brought with him out there in the dark of Carlisle Street waiting. He could also hear at a frequency that Carver probably couldn't identify the sound of Carter's radio 2 blocks south, the sound of other things in other positions that Carver didn't know about. Vernon isn't going to accept that story, Carver said. That's not a story, Jack said. That's what happened. One man, Carver said. He looked at Jack, really looked the way people look when they're trying to reconcile 2 versions of something. One man put 3 of Dylan's guys down. Dylan's guys weren't as capable as Dylan believed, Jack said. That's a management problem, not mine. Something flickered in Carver's face. It took Jack a moment to recognize it because it was the last thing he expected to see in a man who had come here with 29 other people to make a point. It was respect, not friendship, not warmth. The specific, guarded respect of someone who recognizes competence in another person, even when that person is on the opposite side of a situation. Who are you? Carver said. Quiet, personal, not the aggressive version of the question, but the genuine one. A diner owner, Jack said. No, Carver said. No, you're not. Jack held his eyes. And here was the moment, here was the place in the structure of things where what happened next would determine the shape of everything after the decision point. Deacon and Puller were waiting on the information Carter needed, the fulcrum around which the next several hours would turn. Jack reached into the back pocket of his jeans and pulled out the vest. He'd gone to the basement after sending Sarah upstairs. He hadn't planned to bring it with him, but some instinct had moved him back down there past the storage room to the panel behind the water heater, and his hands had found the box and opened it and taken out the leather vest, and he'd carried it upstairs without entirely deciding to. He laid it on the counter between himself and Carver. The faded patches, the worn leather, the thing that had once meant something specific in a world Carver would understand. Carver looked at it. He looked at the patches. Even faded, certain things were recognizable to someone who knew what to look for. Then he looked up at Jack, and the expression on Carver's face changed in a way that was both immediate and total. Jesus, Carver said. His voice had dropped. Jesus, I used to be, Jack said, a long time ago. Carver stared at him, and Jack watched the man do the arithmetic, put together the 3 men on the floor, the name that had been attached to the situation, the thing he was looking at on the counter, and the number of people Vernon Holt had sent to handle. What Carver was now understanding was not what Vernon Holt had been told. Vernon doesn't know, Carver said. No, Jack said. Dylan doesn't know, Vernon doesn't know, and nobody needs to know if this ends tonight without anyone getting hurt. He held Carver's eyes. But I need you to do something that requires you to make a choice between your boss and your own judgment. Carver looked at him. What? He said. I need you to call Vernon, Jack said. Right now, with me in the room. And I need you to tell him exactly what you found here. Not what Dylan told him, what you found. He paused. Because what's happening here is that your boss is about to walk into a situation based on bad information, and the outcome of that situation is not going to be what he's expecting. And I think you're smart enough to know that. Carver was very still. Outside, his 29 men were waiting on the street. In the kitchen, Deacon and Puller were in positions Carver didn't know about. 3 more of Jack's people were 20 minutes out. Ruiz and 7 others were now closer to 2 hours than 4. Carter was 2 blocks south with 2 deputies and a radio line to Billings. And on the second floor of the building, a 25-year-old woman was pressed back from a window with her phone recording everything she could see and Carter's number written on the inside of her wrist. Carver looked at the vest on the counter. He looked at Jack. If I make that call, Carver said slowly, I'm telling Vernon to stand down. That's not something he takes well. I know, Jack said, but it's better than the alternative. Which is, Jack picked up the vest from the counter and folded it carefully the way you fold something that has weight beyond its physical mass. The alternative, Jack said, is that 30 men try to make a point in a town where I know every person, every building, and every exit, and where people I trust are already in position. And Vernon finds out who I actually am, not from his research of people, but the hard way. He set the folded vest on the counter. That's not a threat. It's an assessment. Carver looked at him for a long, long moment. In his face, Jack could see the man running the numbers, running the scenario, running the thing Carver clearly had more capacity for than his employer had given him credit for. Then Carver reached into his jacket and took out his phone. I'm going to need you to tell me something first, Carver said. A name, the real one, not Jack Walker. He looked at the vest, the one on those patches. Jack met his eyes. Ghost Rider, Jack said. Carver stopped breathing for a half second, the phone in his hand, the name in the air between them. I heard that name, Carver said very quietly. When I was coming up, people talked about it. They said he stopped. I know what they said, Jack said. Carver looked at him with something in his face that had moved well past the calculation of the situation into something more personal. Something that was almost, if you could believe it, in a man who had walked into this building with 29 other men to make a point, something that was almost wonder. He dialed. It rang twice. Carver! Vernon Holt's voice came through the phone, audible in the quiet of the empty diner. Sharp controlled the voice of a man who was accustomed to people using his name with care. What are you looking at? Carver took a breath. A problem, Carver said, but not the one you think. Vernon Holt's voice through the phone had the quality of a man who had not been surprised by anything in a very long time, and had come to regard that as one of his defining characteristics. Carver, he said, I sent you there to make a statement. What I'm hearing is that you're making a phone call instead. Yes, sir, Carver said. He was standing at the counter of Walker's diner with the phone to his ear, and Jack Walker directly across from him, and the specific quality of Carver's voice in that moment was the quality of a man navigating something he hadn't been briefed for. I need to give you information before we proceed. Then give it. Dillon's report was inaccurate, Carver said. There's no operation here. No group. The diner is a diner. He paused. And the man who put Dillon's people down, he's not who we thought he was. A silence on Holt's end. The particular silence of a man recalibrating. Explain that, Holt said. Carver looked at Jack. Jack gave him nothing, just looked back steady and patient, the way a man looks when he's already decided how this conversation ends, and is willing to wait for everyone else to arrive at the same conclusion. The name Ghost Rider mean anything to you, Carver said. The silence this time was different, longer and with a different texture, the texture of someone going through a mental file and finding something that shifted the weight of everything else around it. Where did you hear that name? Holt said. Not quite a question. From the man standing in front of me. Another silence. Put him on, Holt said. Carver held the phone out across the counter. Jack looked at it for a moment, then picked it up. Mr. Holt, Jack said. Who is this? Flat, controlled. The voice of a man managing his response very carefully. My name is Jack Walker. I own a diner in Fairview, Montana. 3 days ago, 12 men sent by someone working for you destroyed a significant portion of my property and put their hands on a young woman who works for me. Jack's voice was conversational, almost gentle. I'd like this to end without anyone else having a bad night. Ghost Rider is dead, Holt said. He's been dead for 20 years. That's the story I know. People say a lot of things, Jack said. The people who knew that name personally, Holt said slowly, are not people you invent associations with. You understand what I'm telling you. I will check. Check, Jack said. I'll wait. A pause. You're serious, Holt said. I opened a diner in Montana 18 years ago because I wanted to make breakfast for people who needed somewhere quiet to start their day, Jack said. That's a serious choice. That's the only thing I've been serious about for 18 years. Your man Dillon Cross walked into my place, wrecked 18 years of serious work, and put his hands on my employee. His voice stayed even. That got my attention in a way things haven't gotten my attention in a very long time. The line was quiet for what felt like longer than it was. What do you want? Holt said. I want you to call your people off, Jack said, permanently. I want Dylan Cross to answer for what he did to the business owners in the towns he's been moving through, and I want the people in this town to go back to their lives without carrying the memory of something they shouldn't have had to see. And if I don't, Jack looked at Carver across the counter. Carver was watching him with the focused attention of a man who understood he was witnessing something he was going to be telling people about for a long time. Then 30 men try to do something in a town where I know everything and they know nothing, Jack said. And the outcome of that is going to create documentation that the organized crime unit in Billings has been trying to produce for 22 months. He paused. I'm offering you an exit, Mr. Holt, from this specific situation. What you do with your organization after tonight is your business, not mine. Silence. You've been talking to law enforcement, Holt said. Law enforcement has been talking to me, Jack said. There's a difference. And I'll be honest with you about something. I'm not interested in your operation. I'm not interested in whatever you're building or where you're building it. I'm interested in one small town in Montana and the people in it who deserve to not have their lives disrupted by men who drove here from somewhere else looking for something to break. He stopped. Let that sit. I think you understand the difference between personal and business. This is personal. Another long silence. Jack heard Holt breathing on the other end, heard very faintly the sound of movement on Holt's end, the sound of a man changing his physical position, which is what people do when their thinking shifts. I need to verify the name, Holt said finally. I know. This call needs to hold for 20 minutes. I'll be here, Jack said. He held the phone down to his side without ending the call and set it on the counter face up so Holt could hear ambient sound but not conversation. Then he looked at Carver. 20 minutes, Jack said. Carver nodded slowly. You're asking him to walk away from a loss. I'm giving him a reason to walk away that isn't just accepting a loss, Jack said. There's a difference. Men like Vernon Holt don't respond to demands. They respond to information that changes the calculation. Carver looked at him with the expression he'd been wearing since the name left the air between them. That particular look that had wonder in it, an assessment in it, and something harder underneath both of those. Were you really? Carver stopped, restarted. The things people said about Ghost Rider, were they true? Some of them, Jack said. Probably not the parts that got exaggerated over time. The parts that were true are the parts I'm not proud of. He held Carver's eyes. That's generally how it works. Carver was quiet for a moment. Why did you leave? He said. Jack picked up the phone from the counter and looked at it still active, the tiny sound of Holt's end of the line, a room people, moving quietly, someone speaking in the background at a distance. I lost someone, Jack said. Someone I should have kept safe and didn't. The life I was living made it impossible to keep her safe, and I understood after she was gone that it was going to keep making it impossible for anyone I cared about. He set the phone back down. So I stopped living that life. Carver absorbed this. And you built a diner, he said. And I built a diner, Jack said. And for 18 years, nobody got hurt. Carver looked at the counter, at the folded vest, at the phone. Dylan shouldn't have come here, Carver said. It was the closest thing to an apology that the situation was likely to produce, and both men understood that. No, Jack said, he shouldn't have. The 20 minutes that followed were the strangest Jack had spent in a very long time. He stood at the counter of his own diner in the deepest part of the night with a man sent to cause him serious harm, who was now standing very still and not causing harm, and around them, the particular suspended quality of a situation that had not yet resolved but had stopped actively deteriorating. Deacon came out of the kitchen at the 12-minute mark. He moved to the far end of the counter and poured himself coffee without being asked, and Carver clocked him and his vest and the way he carried himself and said nothing. Puller came out 2 minutes after that and stood near the door in the particular way he stood near, things which communicated a great deal without communicating it loudly. At 17 minutes, 2 more of Jack's people came in through the back. Carver watched them arrive. He looked at Jack. You said there was nobody else, Carver said. I said there was nobody else when Dylan sent his people here. Jack said. That was true then. This is now. Carver thought about this for a moment and then appeared to accept the distinction. At 21 minutes, the phone buzzed on the counter. Jack picked it up. I made 3 calls, Holt said. 3 people who would know. 2 of them said the name is real. The third one said, a pause. The third one said, I should not be in whatever town you're in. Jack said nothing. You've been in Montana for 18 years, Holt said. You've been running a diner. Yes. And Dylan Cross walked into your diner. He did. A silence that carried Jack thought the particular weight of a man making a business calculation that had acquired personal dimensions he hadn't planned for. Dylan is going to answer for the inaccuracy of his report, Holt said. His voice was flat and final in a way that told Jack this was not something Dylan was going to enjoy. That's internal. I understand. What happens to Dylan regarding the diner and the other businesses, that's something I'm willing to discuss in terms of cooperation with whatever process your sheriff needs to run. Jack felt something in his chest ease slightly. Carter had said it. What the organized crime unit needed was something linking Holt to the actions of his people. Holt offering to discuss cooperation with the legal process was something considerably beyond what Jack had expected from this call. Why, Jack said. It was an honest question, not a negotiating move. Holt was quiet for a moment. Dylan was not authorized to operate the way he operated, Holt said. He went beyond his brief. The damage he caused to those businesses was not sanctioned, and the liability it creates for my organization is a problem I would prefer to resolve through controlled means rather than exposure. Another pause. Also, Holt said, and his voice did something unexpected, something that had an almost reluctant quality to it. Also, Ghostwriter is a name that means something. The people who carry names that mean something in that world, they don't get moved on without consequences that last. I'm not interested in that kind of consequence. Jack held the phone. Your people go home tonight, Jack said, all of them. Carver drives them out personally. Agreed, I am. And I want your direct number, Jack said. One call, 1 hour in the next 48 hours, where I give you specifically what you need to say to Carter and his contact in Billings, so this resolves cleanly without either of us having to go further. A pause. You're asking me to give you leverage, Holt said. I'm asking you to clean up a mess your employee made, Jack said. The leverage already exists. I'm just making the process more efficient. Another pause. Shorter this time. Holt gave him the number. Jack wrote it on his own wrist below, where Carter's number had been that he'd written for Sarah. The call ended. Jack set the phone on the counter and looked at Carver. Carver was looking at him with an expression that had completed its journey from the calculation it had started as to something that was simply genuinely human. That's done, Jack said. Yeah, Carver said. He looked at the phone, then at the vest, then at Jack. He's going to keep his word. Vernon doesn't make agreements. He doesn't keep. It's actually the thing about him that... He stopped. It's a thing about him. I know, Jack said. I checked before I called you. Carver looked at him for a moment. You checked. Mac has 18 months of observations on Vernon Holt's organizational behavior. Reliability and agreements that serve his interests is documented. I wouldn't have offered this particular arrangement if it wasn't. Carver was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You were ready for this. All of it. I was ready for what I could prepare for, Jack said. The rest I adapted to. Carver picked up his phone and went to the door of the diner. He pushed it open and stood in the threshold and looked out at Carlisle Street and the men out there who had come here for a purpose that had evaporated. Pack it up, Carver said. We're done here. Jack didn't go to the window. He stood at the counter and listened to the sound of men and vehicles rearranging themselves in the direction of departure. The sound of engines starting the diminishing rumble of a convoy that had come for one thing and was leaving with another. It took 11 minutes. Then Carlisle Street was quiet. Carter's voice on the radio, they're moving, all vehicles heading south on Route 9. A pause. Jack, what just happened? Jack picked up the radio. I'll explain in the morning, Daniel. Jack. In the morning, Jack said. Go home. Get some sleep. I'll have something for you tomorrow that the Billings unit is going to want very badly. A silence. Carter breathing. You better have a very good explanation, Carter said. I have an extremely good explanation, Jack said. I just need to figure out how to tell it in a way that doesn't give you more problems than it solves. Another pause. Okay, Carter said in the tone of a man who is going to spend the rest of the night not sleeping. Morning. The radio clicked off. Deacon had come back to the counter. Puller was at the door watching the street, but he'd shifted into a different quality of watchfulness, the kind that monitors rather than anticipates. 3 more of ours are still coming, Deacon said. Call them off, Jack said. Tell them it's resolved. Deacon looked at him for a moment, then he pulled out his phone. Just like that, Deacon said. Not just like that, Jack said. But yes. Deacon made the call. Puller came back from the door and sat at the counter and looked at the folded vest for a moment, and then at Jack. That was clean, Puller said. That was the cleanest version of that I've seen in a long time. I didn't want anyone getting hurt, Jack said. Most people say that, Puller said. They mean it less than you do. The sound above them, footsteps on the staircase. Sarah came through the door from the stairwell with her phone in her hand and her face showing the specific combination of relief and residual adrenaline of someone who has been waiting in a tense situation for the outcome. She looked at Jack. She looked at Deacon and Puller. She looked at the counter with the vest on it and the 2 coffee mugs and the radio. It's over, she said. For tonight, Jack said. Yes. She let out a breath, not a dramatic breath, not a collapse, just the breath that escapes when a body has been holding something and gets permission to let it go. I recorded everything, she said. I have footage of the vehicles, the men on the street, Carver coming in. I have audio from when the door was open. She held up her phone. Jack looked at the phone, then at her. How did you get audio from the kitchen? I came to the top of the stairs, she said. Before you told me not to come to the door, I was at the top of the stairs. I heard most of it. She looked at him steadily. The name, what Carver said, what you said to Vernon Holt. Jack was quiet. Ghostwriter, Sarah said. She said it without drama, without performance. Just put the name in the air between them, the way you put something on a table that needs to be looked at. Yes, Jack said. Who was she? Sarah said. Jack looked at her. You said you lost someone, Sarah said. That's why you left. Who was she? The diner was very quiet. Deacon and Puller had both found reasons to look somewhere other than at Jack with the practiced discretion of people who understood the difference between what was their business and what wasn't. Jack picked up the folded vest from the counter. He held it for a moment, the weight of it, the particular sensory memory that objects carry when they have been significant enough for long enough. Her name was Christine, he said. She was 28. She taught elementary school. She had absolutely nothing to do with the world I was living in, and I told myself that meant she was safe, that the separation was enough. He set the vest back on the counter. I was wrong. Someone used her to get to me, and I wasn't there when I should have been. He stopped. Sarah looked at him with the full undivided attention that had been the first thing he'd noticed about her 3 years ago. I'm sorry, she said. Simple and direct and completely sufficient. I built the diner, Jack said, because I needed something that required me to show up every morning and take care of something. Because the alternative was... He stopped. The diner kept me going in the right direction. Sarah was quiet for a moment. And we all got the benefit of that, she said. Jack didn't say anything. I mean it, Sarah said. Every single person who sat at that counter in 18 years. Roy, the Dunmore sisters. The kids from the high school who came in for the cheap breakfast before class. All of us. She held his eyes. We got the benefit of whatever drove you to build this place. Jack looked at her. At the seriousness and the steadiness and the genuine quality of her, the thing that had made him hire her on the spot 3 years ago, without quite being able to articulate why at the time. You should have been somewhere safer tonight, he said. You should have been somewhere safer your whole life, she said back without heat. But here we both are. She set her phone on the counter. I'm going to send this footage to Carter before I do anything else. That's the right move, yes. Yes, Jack said. She sent it. 23 seconds. Done, she said. Now I'm going to make coffee because I think all of us could use it, and then you're going to tell me what comes next. Deacon looked up. He had been almost entirely still for the last 10 minutes, and he looked up with the expression of someone who had just revised his assessment of someone else upward. I could use coffee, he said. Sarah already had the pot going. What came next as Jack explained it, while the coffee brewed was the part that required the most care because the confrontation on Carlisle Street was not the end of the situation, only the end of the immediate physical danger. The remaining work was the kind that required patience and precision rather than the confrontational clarity of the previous hours. Holt had agreed to cooperate with the legal process, but agreement and execution were different things, and the agreement needed to be handled in a way that produced the documentation Carter's contacts and billings required, while also giving Holt enough control of the narrative that he'd follow through. Jack had one phone call window to make this happen. The call needed to be structured, and he needed Carter involved in structuring it. And Carter needed to be brought far enough into Jack's actual history that he could conduct that conversation with the Billings unit without it unraveling due to gaps. That conversation with Carter was the part Jack was not looking forward to. He sat up until 4 in the morning thinking about how to have it. Deacon fell asleep at the counter eventually, which was a thing Deacon had always been able to do, sleep anywhere, in any conditions, the way soldiers learned to. Puller stayed awake and drank coffee and said almost nothing, which was Puller's mode of companionship and always had been. Sarah was at the other end of the counter with her phone going through the footage she'd taken. At 4:17, she looked up. "Jack," she said. He looked at her. "In the footage," she said, "when Carver's men were on the street, there's one of them off to the side, not with the main group." She turned her phone to face him. "He's photographing the diner, and not just the diner. He's photographing the building next door, and the one next to that." Jack looked at the footage. "That's not Holt's people," he said. He said it quietly with the particular quality of someone who has just understood something that changes the shape of things. "Then whose?" Sarah said. Jack looked at the image on her phone. The figure at the edge of the frame angled away from the group, doing something entirely different from what the group was doing. He thought about the 22-month organized crime investigation. He thought about the Billings unit. He thought about what Carter had said 60 to 70% of the way to a case. He thought about someone who might want to be closer to 100%, who might have understood that something was coming to Fairview before it came, who might have positioned someone to document it. "Daniel Carter is going to have a very interesting explanation to give me in the morning," Jack said quietly. Sarah looked at the screen, then at Jack. "You're not angry," she said. "No," Jack said. And he wasn't exactly. He was something more complex than angry, something that was partly the feeling of having been outmaneuvered by someone he'd underestimated, and partly a reluctant recognition that being outmaneuvered in this particular direction toward documentation, toward a legal case, toward accountability, through the right channels was not actually the worst thing that could have happened tonight. Carter had positioned someone to record what went down on Carlisle Street, which meant Carter had been further ahead of all this than he'd let on, which meant Jack Walker was not the only person in Fairview keeping secrets. He almost laughed. He didn't, but it was close. "Get some sleep," he told Sarah. "I'm going to need you sharp in the morning." "I'm already sharp," she said, but she stood up and stretched and looked at him with the look she gave him when she was going to listen to what he said without conceding that he'd been right. She went upstairs. The diner was quiet again, Deacon breathing slow at the counter, Puller with his coffee, the refrigerator hum. The first faint change in the quality of the dark outside that meant 4:30 was approaching 5. Jack thought about Dylan Cross. Dylan was the part of this that remained unresolved in a way that mattered. Holt had said Dylan would answer internally for the inaccuracy of his report, and Jack understood what that meant, and it was not nothing, and he was not going to pretend he was entirely unmoved by the idea of Dylan Cross experiencing consequences delivered by his own employer. But internal consequences were not the same as accountability for what Dylan had done to the people in the towns he'd moved through. The business owners, the families, the people who'd stayed silent because they were afraid. That part required a different approach. And that part Jack thought was going to be Carter's work. Properly this time. With the documentation from tonight, with whatever the Billings unit could build on it, with the cooperation Holt had agreed to provide. Jack had his role in that, but his role was the preparation, not the delivery. That was the part of this he needed to make sure he understood clearly, because the version of himself that had existed before the diner would have wanted to be the delivery, would have wanted to be the instrument of the consequence, to be present for it, to make it personal and physical and felt. That version of himself had needed that, had been built around needing it. The version sitting at the counter of his own diner at 4:30 in the morning, listening to Deacon breathe and watching the dark outside the cardboard patch window begin its slow retreat, that version had different needs. And the first of those needs was to let the right people do the right things, which was considerably harder than doing it yourself, but considerably less likely to cost someone you cared about something they couldn't get back. He'd learned that the hard way. He'd learned it with Christine. He thought about her now, which he rarely allowed himself to do. The specific way she'd said his name, his real name, not the road name, the name his mother had given him, the name he'd left behind with everything else. The way she'd said it, like it meant something to her, specifically not as a title or a handle or an identity, but as the sound that belonged to a particular person she'd decided to love, despite knowing better. She would have been 50 now. She would have had lines at the corners of her eyes from the particular way she smiled, which was always bigger than she planned for it to be, always slightly surprising even to her. She would have been teaching, still probably she'd been the kind of teacher who didn't stop teaching, who found students in every situation, who had tried more than once to teach Jack things about himself that he hadn't been ready to learn. He thought about what she'd said the last time he'd seen her. He didn't let himself think about it often because it was the kind of memory that had edges. But tonight it felt necessary. She'd said, "You are more than this. I know you don't believe me yet, but you will." He hadn't believed her. Not then. He'd believed the version of himself that the road had built, capable and hard and necessary and ultimately isolating, in the way that things built entirely for function tend to become isolating. He believed her now. He had for a long time. And the complicated thing about believing her now was that the belief had come too late to give her anything, but not too late to become something, to become the diner, to become the mornings, to become the version of Jack Walker that Roy Hendricks trusted and Sarah Mitchell worked beside and Daniel Carter ate breakfast with twice a week. That was Christine's work in a way, done from the wrong side of a loss that still hurt 18 years later in the specific way that certain losses never stop hurting. Not acutely, not daily, but with a permanence that is somehow also a form of companionship. Jack sat with that for a while. Then the first light started coming through the gap at the edge of the cardboard patch in the window. Just the beginning of it, gray and tentative, and he stood up and went into the kitchen and started the coffee for the morning, because the diner opened at 5:30 and people were going to come in and sit at the counter and they were going to need coffee. Some things were bigger than what happened at night. The mornings were always bigger. At 5:40, Carter walked in. He came in looking like a man who had not slept, which he had not. He sat at his stool, his own stool second from the left, the regular stool, and put his hat on the counter and looked at Jack with the expression of a man who has been awake thinking about a conversation and has arranged what he wants to say, but knows perfectly well that the conversation isn't going to go the way he arranged it. "Carter," Jack said. Jack poured his coffee. "Black, same as always." "Who was on the street last night?" Jack said. "The person with the camera, not Holt's people." Carter's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Almost. "I need you to understand that I had very limited information and I made a judgment call," Carter said. "I'm not angry," Jack said. "I told you that already. You told me that at 4 in the morning by text, which is not the same as saying it in person. I'm telling you now in person." Jack held the man's eyes. "You positioned someone to document what happened. Who?" Carter picked up his coffee. He looked at it, then he looked up. "My contact in Billings has a surveillance team," Carter said. "When I understood last night that something was actually coming to Fairview, not maybe a definite, I called her. She had people 30 minutes out. I authorized them to position on Carlisle." He paused. "I didn't know it was going to go the way it went. I thought I was setting up documentation for something that was going to be worse. Instead, you got documentation for something that resolved without violence," Jack said. "Yes, which is still useful." "Very," Carter said. "Jack, the footage combined with what Sarah sent me, combined with Holt's vehicles on the street, it's enough to reopen 2 of the cases that went cold. It's not the full case, but it's significant forward movement." Jack nodded. "I have a phone number," Jack said. He set a piece of paper on the counter, not the one from the old box, a new one written in the kitchen this morning. "Vernon Holt's direct line. He has agreed to a conversation with someone from the Billings unit in controlled conditions regarding Dylan Cross's unauthorized activities. He won't give you his operation, but he'll give you Dylan's." Carter stared at the piece of paper. "How did you get that?" he said. "I asked him for it," Jack said. Carter stared at him. "You asked Vernon Holt for his personal phone number," Carter said slowly, "and he gave it to you." "We came to an arrangement," Jack said, "one that serves his interests and serves yours and keeps this town out of the middle of something it shouldn't have been in the first place." He held Carter's eyes. "I need you to handle it carefully. Holt will cooperate once and within limits. If the Billings unit pushes beyond those limits, He goes quiet and the opportunity closes. I need you to convey that clearly. Carter looked at the piece of paper. He looked at Jack. He looked at his coffee. Jack, he said, how many laws did you bend last night? I didn't bend any laws, Jack said. I had a conversation with a man who made a business decision. What he does as a result of that decision is his choice, and it happens to align with what your unit needs. He paused. I want Dylan Cross charged. I want the businesses he destroyed compensated. I want the people who've been living in fear of him to feel safe again. And in exchange, I get my diner back, Jack said. My town back, my mornings. Carter held the piece of paper in both hands. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he folded it and put it in his breast pocket. You are the most complicated man I have ever eaten breakfast with, Carter said. I'm a diner owner, Jack said. You want your eggs? Carter stared at him for a moment. Then something moved in his face that was unmistakably the beginning of a smile, reluctant and genuine and slightly disbelieving. Smile of a man who has had a very long night and has arrived somewhere he didn't expect to arrive and finds that it's not the worst place he's ever been. Scrambled, Carter said, not over easy. I know how you take your eggs, Jack said, and went back to the kitchen. At 6:10, Roy Hendricks came in and sat on his stool. He looked at the cardboard in the window. He looked at the counter. He looked at Jack through the pass-through, and then at Carter sitting 2 stools down with his coffee and his hat and his particularly expressive silence. So, Roy said. So, Jack said. Still here, Roy said. Still here, Jack said. Roy picked up his coffee. He wrapped both hands around it, the way he always did, the warm hands-on ceramic gesture of an old man whose circulation wasn't what it used to be. My daughter called again, Roy said, about Billings. What did you tell her? I told her I'd think about it, Roy said. Same as I told her last time. He looked at his coffee. I told her I live somewhere that has good people in it and that matters when you are my age. That the world is a specific enough size already without making it smaller by moving somewhere where you don't know any and who'd notice if you didn't show up. Jack looked at Roy through the pass-through. She understand that, Jack said. She's 43, Roy said. She understands things when she wants to. For the rest, she'll get there eventually. He sipped his coffee. Eggs over medium, Jack. Toast dark. Coming up, Jack said, and the diner opened for the morning. The eggs Roy ordered that morning were the same eggs Jack had been making for him for 11 years. Over medium. Toast dark. Coffee without sugar. The order hadn't changed since Roy's doctor visit 4 years back, and it wasn't going to change. And there was something in that consistency, in the absolute reliable sameness of it, that Jack held on to as he worked the grill that morning with Deacon, asleep at the counter, and Carter on his stool, and Carlisle Street outside beginning its ordinary day, as though the night before had been a dream. Except it hadn't been a dream, and the cardboard in the window was still there. And somewhere south of Fairview on Route 930, men were driving away from something they hadn't been able to do. And somewhere in a city Jack didn't know, Vernon Holt was having a conversation with Dylan Cross that Dylan Cross was not going to enjoy. Jack flipped Roy's eggs at exactly the right moment. He knew the right moment without looking at a clock. 18 years of the same motion, the same heat, the same timing. That was the thing about a diner. It imposed its own rhythm on you. And after enough years, the rhythm became internal, became the structure your days were built around. And that structure was not a small thing. That structure was in ways that were hard to articulate to anyone who hadn't needed it everything. He plated Roy's breakfast and put it through the pass-through and poured himself a third cup of coffee he didn't need and stood in the kitchen listening to the sounds of the morning. Roy's fork against the plate, Carter's mug on the counter, the refrigerator, the street outside, and felt for the first time in 4 days something that wasn't vigilance. It wasn't peace yet. Peace was going to take a while longer to settle back in, but it was the absence of the specific electric hum of a situation in active motion, and the absence of that hum was its own kind of relief. His phone buzzed on the counter beside the grill. He looked at it. Mac, he answered. It's done, Mac said without preamble. It's done, Jack said. A pause. Then in Mac's voice something that was not quite relief but occupied similar territory. How? Carver was smarter than Dylan, Jack said. Holt was smarter than Carver. Turned out the smartest version of this was also the cleanest version. Dylan. Carter's unit in Billings has what they need to charge him. Holt is going to cooperate on the specifics. The people Dylan heard across those towns are going to get something that looks like accountability. Mac was quiet for a long moment. You did all of that, Mac said, without anyone getting hurt, Jack said. Yes. Another pause. Ghost, Mac said. And in the way he said it, all the complicated weight of 20 years of distance and what the distance had cost and what it had produced pressed into a single syllable. She would have, I know, Jack said, before Mac could finish it. Because he knew. He'd been thinking about it since 4 a.m. Since sitting at the counter in the pre-dawn dark thinking about Christine saying, you will believe me eventually. Yeah, Mac said. Mac. Jack turned to face the back wall of the kitchen, giving himself a moment of privacy from the sounds of the diner. Thank you for picking up. You called in the debt, Mac said. That's not favor territory, that's obligation. I know the difference, Jack said. I'm not saying it because of the debt. I'm saying it because you picked up a call from a number you didn't know from a man who'd been gone 20 years at 11 at night, and you didn't hesitate. Silence. Go make your breakfast, Mac said finally. His voice had the gruff quality of a man who is moved and finds being moved inconvenient. People are waiting. He hung up. Jack stood with the phone in his hand for a moment. Then he set it down and went back to the grill and got back to work. By 7:30, the diner was filling up. Word had moved through Fairview the way word moves through small towns, not through any single channel, but through all of them simultaneously carried in the gaps between officially stated things, in the calls people make to each other when something has happened that they're not sure how to name. The story people had was incomplete and imprecise, and somewhat wrong in its details, but correct in its general shape. Something had happened on Carlisle Street last night involving outside men and police in Jack Walker's diner, and the outcome was that the outside men had left and Fairview was still Fairview. People came in to see for themselves. They came in the way people come to a place after something has happened onto it, partly for the coffee, mostly to confirm that the thing they'd heard was real and the place was still standing and the person who ran it was still himself. Jack recognized this need, understood it completely, and met it the same way he met everything, by being exactly where he was, doing exactly what he did, treating each person who came through the door as the most important person who had come through it so far. Old Martha Hensley, who was 78 and walked with a cane and had been coming to Walker's Diner every Tuesday and Thursday for 11 of the 18 years Jack had owned it, sat in her usual booth at 7:40 and looked at the cardboard in the window and at Jack behind the counter and said at a volume that was slightly more than necessary because her hearing had been going for 3 years. Is it true you knocked 3 men off their feet and sent a gang packing? The diner went quiet. Jack looked at Martha. Martha looked at Jack with the absolute unblinking frankness of a woman who has lived long enough to be done with indirect communication. Something like that, Jack said. Good, Martha said, and picked up her menu even though she always ordered the same thing and had for 11 years. I'll have the French toast. The diner exhaled. Someone laughed. Roy from his stool was looking at his coffee with the expression of a man who is smiling but doesn't want to be seen doing it. Carter, who had been nursing his second cup and watching the room, leaned slightly toward Jack as he passed. You've got a fan base, Carter said quietly. I've got customers, Jack said. There's a difference. Not this morning, there isn't. By 9 o'clock, the diner had done twice its normal Tuesday morning traffic. People were lingering longer than usual, partly because they wanted to be there, and partly because there was an atmosphere in the place that felt different, charged with something that was not quite celebration and not quite the aftermath of disaster, but occupied the specific emotional territory between the two, the place where people end up when something bad nearly happened and didn't. Sarah came down at 9:15. She'd slept 4 hours, which showed, but she had also clearly taken care of herself in the way of someone who understood that showing up was important. She was put together, alert, moving with her usual competence, but with something different in how she carried herself. Something that had settled. She took over the floor without being asked and moved through the crowded tables with her order pad and her particular way of actually looking at the people she served. And Jack watched her from behind the counter and felt something that was difficult to categorize, but had its roots in the recognition that the thing you build sometimes turns out to be more than what you intended to build. He'd built a diner, He'd also apparently built something that produced people like Sarah Mitchell, people who stayed up all night on the second floor documenting things on their phone, who had Carter's number on their wrist, who showed up the next morning and took over the floor because the floor needed taking over. He hadn't planned for that, but he was grateful for it in a way that sat deep. At 10:40, his phone rang again. The Billings area code. A woman's voice, professional and direct. Mr. Walker, my name is Agent Reyes. I believe you've been in communication with my contact here regarding the events of last night. Carter, Jack said. Yes, I understand you have some information relevant to an ongoing investigation. I have a phone number, Jack said, and I have specific parameters around how that number gets used, which Carter has already conveyed to you. The question is whether those parameters work for your unit. They're unconventional, Reyes said. Most things that work are, Jack said. A pause. Reyes had the quality on the phone of someone who was used to being the most prepared person in any given conversation and was recalibrating in real time. The footage from last night gives us documented presence of Holt's vehicles and personnel in Fairview, Reyes said. Combined with what we already have, that advances the timeline of the existing investigation significantly. What you're describing, Holt's direct cooperation on Cross's activities, would be, if delivered as described, the piece we've been missing. It'll be delivered as described, Jack said, as long as the call is handled the way I outlined. You're asking us to limit the scope of the questioning. I'm asking you to focus the questioning on Dylan Cross and his specific actions. Holt's larger operation is yours to pursue through your own means. This call gets you Cross. Don't overreach and lose the whole thing by going for more than what's on the table. Reyes was quiet for a moment. You understand this is an unusual position for a private citizen to be negotiating from, she said. I understand that, Jack said. I also understand that you've been working this case for 22 months, and you're short of what you need to close it, and I'm handing you a significant portion of what's missing. The question isn't whether I'm an unusual source. The question is whether the information is real. Is it? Reyes said. Call the number, Jack said, but you'll find out. A pause. I'll be in Fairview this afternoon, Reyes said. I'd like to meet in person. Diner's open until 3, Jack said. Coffee's good. He ended the call and went back to the grill. Deacon found him there 20 minutes later. Deacon had woken up sometime around 9, assessed the situation with the silent efficiency of his nature, and spent the subsequent hour doing something on his phone in the corner booth that Jack hadn't inquired about. Now he was at the pass-through, leaning on the counter on the customer side, looking at Jack, with the expression of a man who has a thing to say and is deciding on the order. We'll be leaving today, Deacon said. Puller's already packed. I figured, Jack said. Ruiz sends his regards. He said to tell you, Deacon paused, selecting something from what was apparently a longer message. He said to tell you that the debt's been cleared both ways. Jack looked at him. Both ways. He said you'll understand that. Jack thought about Ruiz, about the specific situation years ago that had created the debt in the first place, about what both ways meant in that context. Tell him I understand, Jack said, and tell him thank you. Deacon nodded once. He stayed at the pass-through for a moment longer. Jack, he said, yeah. You built a good thing here, Deacon said. He said it simply without decoration, which was the only way Deacon ever said things that mattered to him. I mean that. I've been in a lot of places in the years since. He stopped, started again. This is a good thing. The people in it are good people. He glanced toward the floor where Sarah was taking an order from a family with 2 small children who had come in late for breakfast. That one especially, he said. I know, Jack said. She knows what she's doing, Deacon said. Not just the job. I mean, she knows what she's doing in terms of... He looked at Jack directly. You should tell her about Christine. Jack was quiet for a moment. She doesn't need that weight, he said. That's not your call, Deacon said. That's hers. He straightened from the counter. People who stay up all night on the second floor with their phone, who put Carter's number on their wrist, who come downstairs and make coffee for the men who came to keep their town safe. Those people are not in your life by accident, Jack. You know that. Jack turned back to the grill. Something was close to burning that he needed to attend to. Safe travels, Deacon, he said. Deacon was quiet for a moment. Safe everything, Deacon said. And he went. The lunch rush hit at 11:30, and didn't let up until well past 1, which was unusual for a Tuesday, and which Jack worked through with the focused efficiency of someone who had been running this grill for 18 years and could do it under conditions considerably more demanding than a packed dining room. Sarah worked the floor without a break, moving between tables with the particular energy of someone running on less sleep than they should have, and compensating with purpose rather than caffeine. At 12:50, Dylan Cross walked in. The diner went quiet in stages, the tables near the door first, then spreading inward like a ripple as people recognized him or recognized the quality of how he moved, which was the quality of a man who knew he was walking into something and had made a decision about how to walk into it anyway. He was alone. No crew, no vehicles outside, or if there were, they weren't visible. Just Dylan Cross, 23 years old, in a jacket that looked more expensive than anything else in the room, standing inside the door of Walker's Diner, with an expression that had lost most of the contemptuous ease it had carried 3 nights ago and replaced it with something Jack found harder to read. Sarah had stopped moving. She was at the nearest table order pad in hand, looking at Dylan with the particular stillness of someone who recognized him and was waiting to understand what this meant. Jack came out from the kitchen. He walked to the center of the dining room and stopped. He didn't say anything. He just looked at Dylan and waited, because the nature of a man who walks into a place alone after what had happened 3 nights ago suggested that he had something specific to say, and Jack was willing to give him the space to say it. The diner held its breath. Dylan looked at Jack. He looked at the repaired tables, the new arrangement of things that had been broken and cleaned up and put back. He looked at the cardboard in the window. He looked at Sarah, and when he did, something moved in his face that Jack hadn't expected to see there. "I'm not here to cause a problem," Dylan said. His voice was different. 3 nights ago, it had been performed the voice of someone who had practiced being loud and threatening until it was automatic. Today, it had the specific deflated quality of someone who has experienced consequences and is still absorbing them. "Then what are you here for?" Jack said. Dylan looked at him for a long moment. In the restaurant's silence, the sound of the street outside the refrigerator from the kitchen, the smallest sounds becoming enormous. "My boss called me this morning," Dylan said. "At 6, before I was awake." He paused. "He told me what you did, what you arranged." Another pause shorter. "He told me you could have had him burn everything I touched, and you didn't." Jack said nothing. "He told me what's going to happen with the police," Dylan said. "The Billings thing. He said he's cooperating on my activities." He stopped, swallowed. "He's giving me up." "Yes," Jack said. "Because of what I did here," Dylan said. "Because of what you did in every town you moved through," Jack said. "This is one of them. Just the one where you got the wrong person's attention." Dylan looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. "Why didn't you just—" He stopped, restarted. "You had leverage on Vernon. Real leverage. You could have used it for more than just—" He gestured at the room. "This." "I didn't want more than this," Jack said simply. Dylan stared at him with the expression of someone encountering a motivational structure they genuinely cannot parse. "You didn't want more," Dylan repeated. "I wanted my diner," Jack said, "and I wanted the people you hurt to get some kind of accounting. The rest of it isn't my business." Dylan was quiet for a long time. Long enough that several of the customers closest to them shifted slightly in their seats with the discomfort of witnessing something they hadn't expected to see. "The woman," Dylan said. He glanced towards Sarah. "Your waitress." Sarah looked at him without expression, waiting. "I'm sorry," Dylan said. It came out with the particular difficulty of a word that a person has not said often enough to make it easy. "For what my guy did, and for the—" He looked at the room again, "for all of it." The silence held for a moment. Jack looked at him. Not the assessing look of someone deciding whether an apology was adequate, but the simpler look of someone trying to see clearly what was in front of them. What he saw was a 23-year-old who had been building something ugly for long enough that it had started to seem like identity, and who was now standing in the wreckage of what that building had produced, and who was perhaps in the way of very young people facing very real consequences, beginning to understand something. It wasn't a transformation. Jack was too honest with himself to call it that. One morning in a diner after the roof had fallen in was not a transformation, but it was a crack. And sometimes cracks were where things started. "Go deal with what's coming," Jack said. "Don't run from it. Let the process do what it's going to do." He held Dylan's eyes. And then figure out what you actually want to build. Dylan looked at him. That's it, Dylan said. What were you expecting? Dylan thought about it. More anger, he said. Anger's expensive, Jack said. I stopped buying more than I need. Something moved through Dylan's expression. Not quite understanding, not yet, but the edge of it. The beginning of a question that might over time, and with the right kind of difficulty, become an answer. He left. The diner exhaled again. Martha Hensley from her booth said loudly, "Good riddance," and 3 tables laughed, and the atmosphere shifted from suspended to release, the particular release of a room that has been holding something and has been given permission to put it down. Sarah appeared at Jack's side. That was unexpected, she said quietly. Yes, Jack said. Do you think he meant it? She said. The apology. Jack thought about it seriously. I think he meant it as much as he's capable of right now, Jack said. Whether that becomes more over time is up to him. Sarah nodded slowly. She looked at the door where Dylan had been. You could have been angrier, she said. I know. But you weren't. No, Jack said, because anger at him specifically wasn't the point. The point was making sure it didn't happen again. To this town or the next one. He looked at her. Anger would have felt better in the moment. It wouldn't have gotten Carter what he needed. Sarah held his eyes. Christine taught you that, she said. Jack went very still. Sarah held the look, not flinching. Deacon told me, she said, before he left. He said you wouldn't tell me and that someone should. She paused. He said she was a teacher. Jack didn't say anything for a moment. She was, he said finally. He said she changed you, Sarah said, long before you left the life. He said she was the reason you eventually left. She was part of it, Jack said, the biggest part. What was she like, Sarah said. Jack looked at her. At the directness that had been the first thing he'd noticed about her that had never diminished in 3 years of working side by side. He thought about what Deacon had said at the pass-through, not your call, hers. She laughed bigger than she meant to, Jack said, every time, like it surprised her. He paused. She was the first person who ever told me I could be more than what I was and made me believe she actually knew what she was talking about. Sarah listened, really listened, the way she'd been listening since the first day. She sounds like someone worth becoming a diner owner for, Sarah said. She is, Jack said, present tense, deliberate. Sarah looked at him for a moment, and what was in her face was not pity. He would have seen pity and understood it and hated it. What was there was something cleaner. Recognition. The kind between two people who understand each other's losses without needing to inventory them. Okay, she said softly, and went back to the floor. Agent Reyes arrived at 2:15. She was younger than Jack expected, mid-30s, with a particular economy of movement of someone who was always running slightly more calculations than what was visible in their expression. She sat at the counter. Jack poured her coffee. She put her hands around the mug and looked at him across the counter and said without preliminary, "The call with Holt happened an hour ago." Jack looked at her, and he said, he was specific, she said, detailed, names, dates, locations, transaction structures, things about Cross's operation that our surveillance had been trying to confirm for 8 months. She paused. He kept to exactly the scope you described. When we pushed on anything broader, he shut down completely and we pulled back. But what we got on Cross, she stopped. It's enough. Jack nodded. Dylan Cross will be charged, Reyes said, probably by end of week. The businesses he damaged, there's a restitution mechanism we can attach to the charges. It won't make everyone whole, but it's something. She looked at her coffee. 4 of the business owners in other towns had already stopped cooperating because they were afraid. When I tell them what happened here, that Cross is being charged, they'll come back in. I'm almost certain of it. Jack said nothing. He looked at the counter and thought about the other towns, the other diners probably. The other people who'd had someone like Dylan walk through their doors and leave damage behind, who'd stayed silent because silence felt like the only option when the person causing damage had a structure behind him and you were standing alone. They won't be alone anymore, Jack said, more to himself than to Reyes. No, Reyes said. She watched him for a moment. Mr. Walker, I've been doing this work for 11 years. I've seen cases built from all kinds of information through all kinds of channels. She paused. What you did here, the way you structured this, I don't have a category for it. It's not complicated, Jack said. Everyone who does something unusual says that, Reyes said. What I did was protect my town, Jack said, and hand the process over to the people whose job it is to run the process. That's not unusual. That's the right order of things. Reyes held his eyes. Most people who have what you have, she said carefully, don't hand things over. They use what they have to expand what they control. I know, Jack said. I've seen both kinds. I decided a long time ago which kind I wanted to be. Reyes was quiet for a moment. Carter said you were complicated, she said. Carter eats here twice a week, Jack said. He's been saying I'm complicated for 11 years. He's not wrong, but he overstates it. Something moved in Rhea's face that was the equivalent in a person of her composure of a smile. She finished her coffee. She put a 10 on the counter. Best coffee I've had in a month, she said. It's the elevation, Jack said. Does something to the extraction. Is that true, she said. I have no idea, Jack said, but people like hearing it. She left. The diner was quiet now. 2:40 in the afternoon, the last few customers settled in their booths with the unhurried ease of people who had nowhere to be. Sarah was doing the side work restocking the condiment stations, and she was singing something quietly to herself that Jack couldn't identify, but that had the rhythm of something older, something from before her generation. His phone buzzed. A text from Mac, 3 words. Ruiz says, well done. He put the phone back in his pocket. Carter came back in at 3 as the last customer was leaving. He came in through the front and sat on a stool and leaned his elbows on the counter with the posture of a man who has had a long day that started very early and has arrived at a moment where he's allowed to feel it. Reyes called me, Carter said. I figured she would. She wants to know if you'd consider a consulting role, Carter said. Those were her words, consulting role. Jack looked at him. No, Jack said. I told her you'd say that, Carter said. Then why'd you bring it up? Because she asked me to. Carter picked up the coffee Jack had already poured. Jack, I need to ask you something and I need you to actually answer it. Jack leaned against the back counter and waited. Are we done? Carter said. Is this finished? Or is there something else coming that I need to prepare for? Jack thought about the question seriously. He thought about Holt, who was a man who kept agreements. He thought about Dylan, who was a man who was about to learn what agreements with the legal system looked like from the inside. He thought about Carver, who had made a choice in this diner 3 nights ago, and whom Jack would probably never see again, but whose name he would not forget. Holt keeps agreements, Jack said. Dylan is being charged. The structure that sent them here is going to be significantly occupied with the consequences of that for a considerable time. He held Carter's eyes. We're done. Carter let out a breath. Okay, Carter said. Okay, Jack said. They held each other's eyes for a moment, these 2 men who had known each other for 11 years and known each other for 4 days, and in the space between those 2 versions of knowing each other was everything that had happened since Tuesday night. All of it, the broken glass, and the phone calls, and the night on Carlisle Street, and the morning eggs, and the folded vest, and the name said aloud after 18 years of silence. You're still the most complicated man I eat breakfast with, Carter said. I'm the only man you eat breakfast with, Jack said. The competition isn't fierce. Carter looked at his coffee. Then he looked up. Thank you, he said. He stopped, didn't finish it. Go home, Daniel, Jack said. Get some sleep. I will, Carter said, and for once it sounded like he meant it completely. After Carter left, Jack locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed, and stood for a moment in the empty diner with the late afternoon light coming through the windows, through the real windows, and through the gap at the edge of the cardboard patch, which he was going to call about first thing tomorrow morning, because the cardboard had done its job, and it was time to let a proper window do the job from here on. Sarah came out of the back with her coat on and her bag over her shoulder, the end-of-shift ritual, as reliable as everything else about her. She stopped when she saw him standing there. You okay, she said. Yeah, Jack said. She looked at him for a moment. You're doing the thing where you stand still in the middle of the room, she said. Is that a thing I do? You do it when you're processing something, she said. I've seen it maybe 4 times in 3 years, usually at the end of a very hard day. She paused. Today qualifies. Jack looked at the room, at the tables that had been damaged and had been righted and set back in their places. At the counter, he'd wiped down 4 times today because the repetitive physical motion of it was grounding. At the coffee pot that had been going since 5:30 in the morning and would go again tomorrow at 5:30 and the morning after that and the morning after that. She would have liked this place, he said. Sarah didn't ask who. She knew who. I think so too, she said, quietly, without performance. She would have liked you, Jack said. Sarah looked at him, and what was in her face in that moment was something that he wasn't going to try to categorize or contain, something real and human, in particular to the two of them in this specific place at the end of this specific set of days that had changed the shape of what they each knew about the other. That it might be the nicest thing you've ever said to me, Sarah said. Don't let it go to your head, Jack said. Too late, she said, but she said it gently. She left. The bell above the door rang and settled into silence. Jack stood alone in the diner. He stood there for a while, not doing anything, not moving through the closing routine that his body could run without thought. Just standing, just being in the room that he'd built, one small decision at a time over 18 years, one morning, at a time, one cup of coffee at a time, one person remembered and welcomed and fed at a time. He thought about the box in the basement, the vest, the photograph, the phone number that had now been called and answered and had produced what it needed to produce. He went downstairs, he moved the tomato cans, he pressed the panel, he reached into the space behind the water heater and took out the box, and he carried it upstairs and set it on the counter, and he stood looking at it for a moment. Then he took out the vest. He unfolded it completely, laid it flat on the counter the way you'd lay out something you wanted to see all at once. The patches faded, the leather worn in the specific places that spoke to years of use, the thing that had once been the primary object through which he understood who he was. He looked at it for a long time. Then he folded it back up, carefully, not the way you fold something you're putting away, the way you fold something you're honoring, with attention and with the acknowledgement that the thing had weight, not the weight of something to return to, but the weight of something that had been real, that had been part of a real life, that had carried both the worst things he'd done and the best, and that deserved to be held with both of those truths simultaneously rather than only one. He put it back in this box. He went back to the basement and restored the panel and moved the cans back into position. But then he stopped, stood in the storage room, and made a decision he hadn't made before. He left the box where it was behind the panel. He was going to leave it there, not because he was hiding it anymore and not because he needed it accessible, but because it belonged here. In the same building as the diner, in the same foundation. It was part of the same structure. Ghost Rider and Jack Walker were not two different people. They were the same person in different seasons. And the current season was the diner, the mornings, the people who came through the door and needed somewhere to sit and be known. That was the season he was in. That was the season he intended to stay in. He went back upstairs and finished the closing routine. He turned off the lights in the dining room. He checked the grill and the refrigerators and the locks. He took the trash out through the back. He stood for a moment in the cold Montana October air behind the diner, looking up at the sky, which was doing what Montana skies do in October, staging something immense and unself-conscious, with the last light of the day, all that space turning colors that don't have names. He thought about Christine saying, "You will believe me eventually." He thought about Roy with his hands around his coffee mug. He thought about Sarah singing something he couldn't identify. He thought about Mac's voice on the phone. Ruiz says, "Well done." He went back inside. He locked the back door. He sat on his stool at the counter. Not Roy's stool, not Carter's, his own. The one at the far right end, where he sat when the diner was empty and had one last cup of coffee in the quiet of the closed place in the particular piece of a room that has held a lot of people in a single day and has released them all and is now simply itself again. He had been afraid when all of this started on Tuesday night that what came out of it would be the end of the ordinary life he'd built. That once the name was in the air again, once the people from before knew where he was, the ordinary life would be impossible to sustain. That the quiet would be broken permanently. That the mornings would be different. What he understood now, sitting in the closed diner on Thursday evening, with the smell of coffee still in the air, and the cardboard patch in the window, and the October cold pressing against the glass, was that the ordinary life wasn't fragile. It had taken the weight of everything that had come at it this week, and it was still here. The diner was still here. Roy's stool was still Roy's stool. The coffee maker would run its first cycle at 5 tomorrow morning, whether anyone was watching or not. You didn't protect something like this by keeping it separate from who you were. You protected it by being fully who you were inside of it, by not pretending the hard parts of your history away, but by letting them sit where they belonged, in the foundation where things that are real and served and learned from belong, while you built the visible structure above them out of the best of what you'd become. That was what Christine had seen in him before he could see it himself. That was what 18 years of mornings had been about. That was what Walker's Diner was. Jack finished his coffee. He rinsed the mug. He turned off the last light. He set the alarm and walked out the front door and locked it behind him. And he stood for a moment on Carlisle Street in the dark and the cold. And Fairview, Montana was exactly what it had always been, a small town with too much sky above it and good people inside it, and ordinary life running through it like water through familiar ground. He walked home. Tomorrow he would open at 5:30. Roy would be in at 6:10. Carter would come by around 7. Sarah would arrive for her shift and take over the floor and remember everyone's orders and sing quietly to herself in the kitchen. The coffee would be good. The eggs would be right. The mornings would keep being the mornings ones. A dangerous man had once decided to become something better than what he was. He'd spent 18 years proving it was possible. And in Fairview, Montana, at the end of a week that had tried its best to take that proof apart and had failed completely, the proof stood. Quiet, ordinary, undefeated. The diner would be open in the morning, and Jack Walker intended to be there.